Hello everyone, and welcome to Midnight Echoes. This video is meant to help you relax, unwind, or maybe even drift off to sleep. So before you get too cozy, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. So feel free to share in the comments. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed the episodes. I suppose if I'd known how strange the night would turn out, I'd have stayed home. Maybe watched a movie. Maybe just stared at the ceiling and thought about the way life slips through your fingers if you're not careful. But I was restless. I'd been stuck in the same monotonous routine for weeks. Wake up, go to work, come home, repeat. My apartment, tucked into a quiet neighborhood in Brooklyn, had started to feel like a cage. The city hummed just outside my window, taunting me with possibilities that I didn't seem to have the energy to explore. It wasn't supposed to be a big night. I was just meeting some friends at a bar in Williamsburg, the kind of place with overpriced cocktails and dim lighting that made everyone look better than they were. One of those nights where you don't expect much, but maybe, just maybe, something different will happen. Something that shakes you out of the routine. I needed that. God, I needed that. I texted my friend Jason to confirm the time, threw on a jacket, and ordered a rideshare through the app. It was quicker than taking the subway, and besides, it was one of those nights where I wanted to get lost in the city without the hassle. The driver was a guy named Michael, or at least, that's what the app said. He was just a few minutes away, so I grabbed my keys and stepped outside. It was early autumn, the kind of evening where the air is crisp, but not cold enough to make you uncomfortable. Perfect weather to get out, clear my head. Standing on the sidewalk, I glanced up at the distant, muted glow of the city skyline. Brooklyn, especially this part of it, felt quieter at night. The streets were still busy, but there was a serenity to it, a sense of detachment from the bustling core of Manhattan. People passed by with their heads down, lost in their own worlds, while the occasional honk from a distant taxi served as a reminder that the city never really slept. My phone buzzed. Michael is arriving in a silver sedan. I watched as a silver car rounded the corner and pulled up to the curb. It looked like the right model, and the license plate matched. I opened the back door and slid inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not the usual mix of car air freshener and faint fast food grease that most rideshare cars have, but something else. Something more. Sterile, like the inside of a hospital, where everything's been scrubbed clean of any trace of humanity. I barely gave it a second thought at the time, though, just figured the guy was a clean freak. "Hey," I said, settling into the back seat. The driver didn't respond immediately. He just looked at me through the rearview mirror, a quick glance that felt longer than it should have. He was older than I expected, maybe mid-40s, with a shaved head and a thick, dark beard. His eyes were hidden behind cheap sunglasses, which struck me as odd since it was already dark out. His lips tightened into something that might have been a smile, but it was hard to tell. "Where to?" he asked, his voice low, almost gruff. There was something off about his tone, but again, I brushed it aside. I was already distracted, scrolling through my phone, checking messages. "Just following the address in the app," I said, not bothering to look up. The car pulled away from the curb. We started moving. The familiar streets of Brooklyn rolled by, and I sank back into my seat, letting my mind wander. I should have paid more attention. It wasn't until we crossed over into Williamsburg that I felt the first twinge of unease. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first. The streets didn't look quite right. The landmarks that should have been familiar felt distant, strange. I figured it was just the dim lighting, or the fact that I hadn't been to this part of the city in a while. Still, something in the back of my mind was tugging at me, telling me to pay attention. "Everything okay up there?" I asked, leaning forward slightly. The driver didn't respond right away. He just kept driving, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Yeah," he finally said, but there was no warmth in his voice. No casual chatter like you usually get with rideshare drivers. Something wasn't right. But I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. It had been a long week, after all. I needed a drink. I needed to relax. The car kept moving, deeper into Williamsburg, but we weren't heading toward the bar anymore. I glanced at my phone, checking the map, and that's when I realized we weren't following the route. The little blue dot was veering off course, taking me somewhere I hadn't asked to go. "Hey, I think you're going the wrong way," I said, a little more forcefully this time. No response. The driver just kept driving. His eyes locked on the road ahead. That's when my pulse started to pick up. At first, I didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was just a mistake, a wrong turn, or something innocent enough. Maybe he was taking a shortcut. But something gnawed at me. That feeling you get in the pit of your stomach when you know something is off. The dark streets of Williamsburg blurred past as the car picked up speed. We were moving away from where the bars and restaurants should have been. "Hey," I said louder this time, my voice breaking through the strange, sterile silence of the car. "You're going the wrong way. I need you to turn around." He didn't respond. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale in the dim light. The tires hummed against the road, a dull, incessant noise that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. I glanced down at my phone again, trying to figure out where the hell we were going. The map app showed we were heading further east, toward some industrial part of the neighborhood, away from the residential blocks and nightlife spots. The blue dot was moving too fast, too far off the route. My heart started pounding harder now. "Dude, stop the car. I need to get out." I wasn't calm anymore. The cold edge of fear crept into my voice. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid, or if something was really wrong, but every fiber in my body was telling me to get out. Now. Still, no response. I pressed the button to unlock the door. Nothing happened. The car kept moving, and the doors stayed locked. Panic flared in my chest. I tried again, pulling at the handle, but it was no use. The doors were locked tight. The driver, Michael, or whatever his real name was, said nothing. His silence was louder than any scream. "Let me out," I shouted, banging on the window now, trying to get his attention. I could feel my breath quickening, my chest tightening with the cold grip of fear. What the hell was happening? Why wasn't he stopping? That sterile smell in the car seemed to grow stronger, filling my nose with something I couldn't quite place, like disinfectant mixed with something metallic. My pulse throbbed in my temples as I realized how wrong this was, how far I'd gone from the normality of my night out. I glanced at my phone again, the screen glowing brightly in the dark car. I dialed 911, my thumb trembling as I hit the call button. But the call didn't connect. The screen showed no signal, no bars. How was that even possible in Brooklyn? My heart was in my throat now, and the realization hit me. It hit me like a punch to the gut. I was trapped. The car kept moving, taking turn after turn, plunging us into some part of Williamsburg I didn't recognize. Dark, industrial streets, with empty warehouses and fenced-off lots. No pedestrians, no lights from apartment windows. Just silence, and the sound of the car's engine. The buildings around us seemed to press in closer, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows that flickered as we sped by. "Stop the car," I shouted again, my voice cracking, panic rising like bile in my throat. That's when he spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "It's too late." My blood ran cold. Too late for what? I couldn't see his eyes behind those sunglasses, but I didn't need to. There was no empathy in his voice, no sign that he was going to stop. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I was locked in a car. I was trapped with a man who clearly had no intention of taking me to my destination, and now we were in the middle of nowhere. I had no choice. I had to do something. Anything. The panic was like a vice around my chest, squeezing tighter with every second that passed. I leaned forward, my fingers brushing the back of his seat as I searched desperately for the lock controls. My hands shook as I tried to find a way to open the door manually. But nothing was working. The car felt like a prison, and he was the warden, silently steering me toward who knows what. I glanced at the dashboard, looking for any kind of clue, something that might help, and that's when I saw it. The GPS screen was turned off, completely blank. There was no route, no map, nothing to suggest he'd ever planned on following the destination I'd entered. This was all part of his plan. I could feel the walls closing in on me. My hands were slick with sweat, and my breaths came in shallow, quick bursts. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. I was in real danger, and no one knew where I was. In a moment of sheer desperation, I lunged forward, grabbing at the steering wheel with both hands, trying to yank it to the side. The car swerved violently, tires screeching against the pavement, as we careened toward the side of the road. He cursed under his breath, jerking the wheel back, trying to regain control. For a split second, I thought I might have a chance, but he was stronger, much stronger. He slammed on the brakes, sending me flying back into my seat. The car screeched to a halt, the sudden stop knocking the wind out of me. I gasped for breath, clutching my chest, trying to regain my bearings. Then, without warning, he turned in his seat. He reached into the back with one hand. I saw the glint of something metal, a knife. My stomach dropped. "You really shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice calm now, as if we were having a casual conversation. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out all other sound. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My body froze, paralyzed by the sight of that blade. But then I did the only thing I could think to do. I threw myself at the door, kicking it with everything I had. The car rocked slightly, but the door stayed locked. I screamed, my voice hoarse, hoping against hope that someone, anyone, might hear me. He didn't move. He just sat there, watching me struggle, his face expressionless behind those sunglasses. The knife glinted in the dim light as he held it up, inspecting it like it was an extension of his hand. He wasn't in any rush. He had all the time in the world. Then he spoke again, almost casually. "You're not the first, you know." His words hit me like a cold slap to the face. Not the first. My mind struggled to process what he meant, but the truth was clear. He'd done this before. He wasn't just some random driver who'd gotten lost. He was a predator, and now I was his prey. I didn't have time to think. The knife in his hand. The knife in his hand. The locked doors. The desolate streets outside. They all screamed the same thing. I was running out of time. He was waiting for something, maybe for me to break completely, to give in to the terror and stop resisting. But that wasn't going to happen. Not like this. I shifted in my seat, trying to keep my movements subtle, all while planning my next move. He had the advantage. He had strength, control of the car, and a weapon. But he wasn't invincible. I had to be smart. I had to be faster than him. "You're not the first," he repeated, almost like he was savoring the words, relishing the way they twisted the knife of fear deeper into my chest. His voice was measured, as if he was discussing the weather. There was no emotion in it, no hint of excitement or urgency. That made it worse. The way he stayed so calm while my life teetered on the edge of oblivion. "Why?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound composed. I didn't care about the answer, but I needed to keep him talking. I needed to buy time to figure something out. He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes, what little I could see of them behind the dark lenses of his sunglasses. "Why?" he echoed, as if amused. As if amused by the question. "Does it matter?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My fingers curled into fists, nails digging into my palms, but I didn't feel the pain. All I felt was the suffocating weight of the situation pressing down on me. Then, in a move that felt almost instinctual, I kicked at the back of the driver's seat as hard as I could. The sudden force threw him forward, and the knife slipped from his grip. It clattered against the center console. I didn't waste a second. I lunged for it, my hand wrapping around the cold metal handle, just as he turned back toward me, his face twisting into a snarl. But I wasn't fast enough. He grabbed my wrist, his grip iron tight, and twisted it until I cried out in pain, the knife dropping from my hand. He slammed my arm back against the seat, pinning me there, his face inches from mine. Now his face was inches from mine. I could see the faint lines of his expression under the streetlights as they flickered by. Calculated, controlled. He wasn't panicked. He was methodical. "You're wasting your time," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. But I didn't listen. My free hand shot out and clawed at the door handle again, yanking with all my strength. I heard a metallic click. The door was unlocked. Somehow, in the chaos of the struggle, I'd managed to get it open. My heart leaped in my chest, a surge of adrenaline giving me a second wind. I threw my body against the door, tumbling out onto the street as the car screeched to a stop. The hard pavement bit into my hands and knees as I scrambled to my feet, disoriented but alive. I looked around. Dark, empty streets. No sign of anyone, but at least I wasn't trapped anymore. I wasn't trapped in that car anymore. The driver got out too, slamming his door and coming around the side of the car. I could see the knife glinting in his hand again, the cold metal reflecting the faint light from the street lamps above. There was nowhere to run except down the street, back toward the industrial buildings. But I had no choice. I ran. My legs were shaking, the cold air burning my lungs as I sprinted. The sound of his footsteps thudded behind me. I could hear him getting closer, his breath steady, while mine was ragged and panicked. I didn't dare look back. Every second spent looking behind me would cost me precious time. All I could think about was putting as much distance between us as possible. I darted around the corner of a large brick building, my heart pounding in my ears. There was a narrow alley up ahead. It was just wide enough to slip through. Without hesitation, I ducked into it, my shoulders scraping against the rough wall as I squeezed past piles of trash bags and abandoned crates. The alley was tight, claustrophobic, but I kept going, driven by the primal need to survive. The sound of his footsteps grew distant, muffled by the walls. He hadn't seen me slip into the alley. For now, I was hidden. I pressed myself against the cold bricks, trying to quiet my breathing. My chest heaved, and I could feel the sting of sweat on my skin. For the first time since getting into that car, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could get away. I pulled out my phone again, my fingers trembling as I opened the map app. This time, a single bar of signal flickered to life on the screen. I was close to civilization. I was close enough to call for help. I dialed Jason's number, praying he'd answer. "Pick up, pick up, pick up," I whispered under my breath, every second feeling like an eternity. Finally, the line connected. "Hello, Jason," I whispered urgently. "Listen to me. I need help. Call the police. I'm in Williamsburg, somewhere near." A shadow fell across the entrance of the alley. I froze. He'd found me. The driver stood at the end of the alley, his figure silhouetted by the dim streetlights behind him. The knife was still in his hand, gleaming faintly. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, waiting, like a predator who knows his prey has nowhere left to go. Jason's voice crackled on the other end of the line, but I couldn't focus on it. My entire world had shrunk to that alley, to the man standing there with a blade. The sound of my own heartbeat hammering in my chest filled my ears. I backed up, deeper into the alley, my eyes darting around for anything I could use to defend myself. But there was nothing, just trash and broken bottles. My phone slipped from my hand, clattering to the ground. Jason's voice became a distant noise, muffled by the sheer panic closing in on me. The driver took a step forward. and then another. I had seconds, maybe less. My options were limited, but my mind was clear now, focused by the adrenaline coursing through me. As he took another step, I turned and bolted toward the back of the alley. My hands hit the metal chain link fence that blocked the exit, rattling it violently as I tried to climb. The fence was old, rusted, and covered in grime, but I didn't care. I pulled myself up, scrambling over the top. I scrambled over the top, just as he reached the fence behind me. I dropped to the other side, landing hard on my feet. Pain shot up through my ankle, but I didn't stop. I kept running, limping slightly, but moving forward. Ahead of me, I saw the distant lights of the city. Buildings, cars, people, safety. I staggered onto the main street, half limping, half running, and waved frantically at the first car I saw. The driver, some random person, slammed on the brakes, their eyes wide with shock as I banged on their window, shouting for help. Behind me, I could hear the driver's footsteps slowing. He didn't follow me onto the street. He stopped at the edge of the alley, watching from the shadows. I didn't need to see him to know he was still there, still waiting. The police arrived a few minutes later, lights flashing, sirens blaring. They asked me questions, but I could barely answer. I was shaking, my thoughts tangled in a mess of fear and relief. All I knew was that I was alive. I'd escaped. As the police questioned me and the driver disappeared into the shadows, I could finally feel the tension draining from my body. I thought I had escaped the worst, that the nightmare was behind me, but something still nagged at the back of my mind. Something didn't add up. The police officers were kind, but methodical, asking for descriptions of the driver, the car, and the events leading up to my escape. I gave them everything I could, my mind still racing with the adrenaline that coursed through my veins. One officer offered to take me to the precinct to file a formal report. I agreed, though part of me just wanted to go home, to shut the door behind me. To shut the door behind me and never think about this again. As we pulled away from the scene in the squad car, I checked my phone. Jason had texted me, "Hey, where are you? Are you still coming to the bar? We've been here a while, man." I stared at the message, my heart skipping a beat. Jason had no idea what I'd just gone through, but what struck me most was that time bomb. He'd sent the text before the ride. He had sent the text before the ride had even started. Just as I was waiting for the rideshare, I had replied that I was on my way. I hadn't canceled. So why had another car come for me? The pieces of the puzzle started clicking into place. The rideshare app had showed Michael as my driver with a matching plate, yet I had never seen that face before. The driver had known too much. He knew where I was going, and the way he had spoken. That eerie calm, as if everything had been meticulously planned. That couldn't have been a coincidence. In a flash, it hit me. The man wasn't a random predator. He hadn't just happened upon me. He had intercepted the ride, posed as the driver, tampered with the app to display his car details. He had been tracking me. But how, and why me? The realization crept over me like a cold shadow. I wasn't the first victim because this wasn't about just anyone. He had been following me, maybe for weeks. The rideshare, the industrial area, the knife, it was all a setup. It hadn't been chance, it had been calculated. He had been waiting for me specifically. But why? What had I done to become his target? As the officer pulled into the station, the words from the driver echoed in my mind, hauntingly clear. "You're not the first." And then something more chilling occurred to me. I won't be the last. Suddenly, the world outside the car felt too open, too exposed. I realized with a sickening lurch that it might not be over. Even though I had escaped, I had no idea who the driver really was, or what his motives were. I had no idea when he might strike again. The terror wasn't just in what had happened that night. It was in knowing that this man was still out there. He had orchestrated this, stalked me, and he could do it again, To me or someone else? And what if I wasn't the only one? What if there were others before me? As the police station's lights grew closer, I realized the nightmare wasn't over. It might never be over. I had survived, yes, but what kind of survival was it when the threat still loomed, waiting in the dark for another chance, another victim? I stared out the window of the police car, my thoughts a tangled mess of fear and disbelief. The driver had disappeared into the night, but he wasn't gone. I knew he would be back, and next time, I might not be so lucky. Next story. It started with a letter, or rather an email, an invitation that, at first glance, seemed too good to be true. I was sitting at my cluttered desk, surrounded by the artifacts of my frustration, half-finished sketches, abandoned canvases, and a growing sense of helplessness. Life had become a suffocating cycle of unpaid bills and artistic failure. So, when I received the email offering a fully funded art residency at the mansion of a billionaire benefactor, it felt like fate. The name attached to the email was one I had heard before, Richard Craymore. He was a legend in the world of high finance, known for his extreme reclusiveness, but also for his generous support of the arts. The invitation promised 6 weeks of uninterrupted time to focus on our work, with every need taken care of. Food, lodging, and materials. It was a lifeline, really. 5 other artists had been selected, and we would each have our own space in Craymore's mansion. The mansion was located deep in the Black Hills of South Dakota, in a town I'd never heard of. The attached pictures showed a sprawling estate, all polished wood, stately brick, and enormous windows that seemed to look out over miles of dense forest. It was isolated, but that was part of its appeal. I imagined myself there, productive, unburdened, creating. For once, the blank canvas wouldn't feel like a threat. I clicked accept before I could talk myself out of it. The bus ride to the estate was long and winding. As the trees closed in around us, I began to realize just how remote this place was. I hadn't seen another house or store for at least an hour. The driver said nothing, but as we approached the mansion, I noticed a faint frown on his face. It wasn't until we pulled up to the wrought iron gates that I fully grasped the scale of the place. Massive, more imposing than the pictures had suggested, with turrets and wings stretching out like claws. I wasn't the first to arrive. 2 others were already waiting near the front steps, both artists like me. One of them, a tall man with wild dark curls, introduced himself as Ethan. He was a sculptor, though I didn't recognize his name. The woman standing next to him, a quiet, intense type, told us her name was Marie, a painter, like me. We exchanged small talk while waiting for the others, discussing our expectations for the residency, speculating about what the mansion would be like inside. None of us had met Craymore in person, but we spoke about him in hushed tones, like he was a ghost, haunting the edges of our thoughts. As we stood there, the sun beginning to dip behind the trees, a chill settled into the air. The massive front door remained closed, as if the house itself was holding its breath. When the others finally arrived, a man in a dark suit appeared from inside, introducing himself as Mr. Conrad, the house manager. He was Craymore's right-hand man, apparently. Mr. Conrad's smile didn't reach his eyes, and his handshake was brief, almost dismissive. He led us inside with a formality that felt out of place, as though we were guests at a funeral. The grand foyer opened up before us, filled with dark wood paneling, high ceilings, and an unsettling number of antique mirrors lining the walls. It was beautiful, but something about the space was oppressive. Something about the way the light seemed to get swallowed by the dark corners. Mr. Conrad led us through the house, showing us to our individual rooms. Each was luxurious, almost absurdly so. Plush beds, velvet curtains, and large windows that looked out over the grounds. But despite the comfort, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every mirror seemed to reflect more than just my image. It felt as though there was someone, or something, lurking just behind my reflection, just out of sight. We were told that Kramer preferred to remain private, and that while we were free to explore the house and the grounds, certain areas were off limits. We weren't to ask questions about him, and we weren't to leave the estate. That last part felt strange, but I brushed it off. It was 6 weeks, after all. 6 weeks of freedom, of uninterrupted work. What could possibly go wrong? The first few days were uneventful. I set up my studio in one of the mansion's many rooms, a vast, sunlit chamber with tall windows overlooking the forest. The other artists did the same, and for a while, we all settled into a kind of uneasy routine. We rarely saw each other during the day, each of us retreating into our respective corners of the house, lost in our own creative worlds. At night, we gathered for dinner in the grand dining room, though the atmosphere was tense. Despite the luxury, there was an undercurrent of tension. It started with the mirrors. No matter where I went in the house, there seemed to be a mirror nearby, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just reflecting the room, but watching me. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. At first, I told myself it was my imagination. This was an unfamiliar place, after all, and isolation plays tricks on the mind. The first unsettling moment happened on the 5th day. I was in my studio, lost in sketching, when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic clicking. At first, I thought it was some mechanical noise, maybe the heating system or old pipes. But as I listened closer, I realized it wasn't coming from anywhere in the room. It was coming from inside the wall. I paused, pencil hovering over the paper, and strained to hear. The sound was faint but persistent. The rational part of my brain told me it was just the old house settling, or some animal trapped in the walls. After all, buildings like this were bound to have strange noises. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Something about the clicking felt unnatural. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my work. But for the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about that sound. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch, growing louder in my mind. That night at dinner, I casually brought up the clicking noise to the others. We were all seated around the long dining table, eating in relative silence. Ethan laughed it off, suggesting it was just the house settling. But I noticed the way Marie's face tightened. She didn't laugh. Instead, she looked down at her plate, pushing her food around with her fork. "I heard it too," she said quietly, not looking up. "In my room. It started 2 nights ago." For a moment, the table fell silent. I glanced around, trying to gauge the others' reactions. The other 2 artists, Leah and Mark, exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. The only person who seemed unaffected was Mr. Conrad, standing silently by the side of the room. His presence had always been unsettling, but tonight it felt worse. Like he was listening to every word we said, as though he were recording us with those cold, expressionless eyes. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, too still. I found myself listening for the clicking sound again, waiting for it to start. Hours passed, and just when I was about to drift off, I heard it, soft, rhythmic, just like before. This time, it was closer. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. The noise was coming from the hallway now, just outside my door. I stared at the dark gap under the door, expecting to see shadows move, but there was nothing. The clicking continued, moving slowly down the hall, as if someone was pacing back and forth. I wanted to open the door, to see what it was, but something held me back. Instead, I sat there in the darkness, heart racing, until the noise finally stopped. In the morning, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a dream, that I had imagined the whole thing. But when I left my room, I found Marie standing in the hallway, pale and wide-eyed. "You heard it too, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. There was something desperate in her eyes that sent a chill down my spine. As the days passed, the tension in the house grew. The clicking sound wasn't the only strange thing anymore. Little by little, other unsettling details began to emerge. I would leave my studio for a break, only to return and find my sketches moved or rearranged. At first, I thought I was simply misremembering where I had left them, but the more it happened, the more certain I became that someone was coming into my space when I wasn't there. I wasn't the only one. At dinner one night, Leah mentioned that her camera had gone missing for a few hours, only to turn up in a completely different part of the house. Mark claimed that he had heard footsteps in the attic above his room, but when he went to check, he found the door locked tight. The mansion, once a sanctuary for our creativity, was beginning to feel like a trap. Ethan remained dismissive, chalking everything up to the quirks of an old house. But even he couldn't deny the growing sense of unease. It was in the air, thick and oppressive, like the walls themselves were closing in on us. And then, one night, something happened that none of us could explain. It was late, well past midnight, when I heard the knocking. At first, I thought it was the clicking noise again, but this was different, louder, more deliberate. Someone was banging on my door. I got out of bed and opened it cautiously, expecting to find one of the other artists, but the hallway was empty. The knocking continued though. It was coming from down the hall, from Marie's room. I stepped out into the corridor, my heart pounding, and hurried toward her door. When I reached it, I knocked softly, calling her name. There was no answer. I tried the handle, but it was locked. That was when I noticed the light seeping out from under the door, faint but flickering, like a candle or a dying flashlight. I knocked again, harder this time. Marie, still nothing. I turned to go find Mr. Conrad, but as I did, the door creaked open just a crack. The light inside flickered once, and then went out. I pushed the door open all the way, but the room was empty. Marie was gone. The bed was unmade. Her clothes were strewn across the floor, and her suitcase lay open, half-packed. It looked like she had left in a hurry, but there was no sign of her anywhere in the house. We searched for hours, combing through every room, but it was as if she had vanished into thin air. By the time the sun came up, the realization had settled in. Marie was gone, and none of us knew why or how. The most disturbing part. Mr. Conrad didn't seem surprised. He offered no explanation, no concern, only a cold reassurance that everything was fine, that Marie had simply decided to leave early. None of us believed him, but what could we do? We were trapped here, miles from the nearest town, with no car and no way to leave. The phone lines were dead, and our cell phones had no signal. We were isolated, completely at the mercy of this place. The next few days passed in a haze of growing paranoia. The clicking noises continued, more frequent now, and I was certain I wasn't imagining them. I began to notice other things too. Cameras, hidden in the corners of rooms, barely noticeable unless you were looking for them. There was one in my studio, mounted high on the wall, and another in the hallway outside my room. We were being watched. The mansion had turned into a prison, and we were the prisoners. I confronted Mr. Conrad about the cameras, but he dismissed my concerns with vague explanations about security measures. It didn't sit right with me. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like we were being studied, like rats in a cage. Ethan, who had been the most dismissive, began to crack as well. One evening, after dinner, he pulled me aside and whispered that he had seen something in the woods, just beyond the estate. He wouldn't say what, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice shaking, "before it's too late." I nodded, but deep down, I knew the truth. There was no escape. Whatever was happening in this house, it had already begun, and we were trapped. I'm not sure when it fully hit me that we were never leaving. Maybe it was after Marie's disappearance, or maybe it was the moment I realized our phones would never connect to the outside world. Mark and Leah were feeling it too. They had become jittery, constantly glancing over their shoulders, whispering to each other in hushed tones. Even Ethan, who had initially dismissed everything, had stopped working on his sculptures. He spent his days pacing the halls like a caged animal. We were prisoners. There was no other way to describe it. And the worst part, Kramer still hadn't shown himself. It was as though we were trapped in some kind of maze. I didn't have to wait long to find out what that maze was for. A few nights after Marie disappeared, things took a turn for the worse. I was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, unable to sleep, when I heard it again, the clicking. This time though, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the window. I sat up slowly, heart pounding, and looked toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but there was something moving behind them. A faint shadow, barely visible. I stood, my legs trembling, and crossed the room. My hands shook as I reached for the curtain, and when I finally pulled it back, I froze. There, standing just beyond the glass, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, but as I stared, I realized it was something else. It was too tall, too thin, its limbs long and spindly, like some grotesque imitation of a human. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle. Where its eyes should have been, there were only dark, hollow sockets. I stumbled backward, breath catching in my throat. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, its face pressed up against the glass. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My body refused to respond. All I could do was stare in horror. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. One moment it was there, and the next, the window was empty. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I told the others what I had seen. Ethan looked skeptical, but Mark and Leah were pale, their eyes wide with fear. They had seen it too, they said. Not just once, but multiple times. The figure, or whatever it was, had been watching us for days. "We need to leave," Leah said, her voice trembling. "I don't care how. We have to get out of here." I agreed, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't be easy. The mansion was isolated, miles from the nearest town, and the forest that surrounded it was thick, almost impenetrable. Even if we tried to walk, we wouldn't get far. And then there was Mr. Conrad. He had become a shadow, always lurking just out of sight, watching us with those cold, expressionless eyes. Every time I caught a glimpse of him, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as if he knew exactly what was happening, as if he were part of it. We tried to confront him that evening, demanding answers, but he just smiled that thin, humorless smile and told us not to worry. "Mr. Kramer has everything under control," he said, but by now, I wasn't even sure Kramer existed anymore. The more I thought about it, the more I began to suspect that we had been brought here not by a man, but by something else. The figure in the window, the cameras, the strange noises, none of it made sense. That night, things escalated. I had barely slept since seeing the figure at the window, and the constant clicking in the walls had become unbearable. I couldn't focus on my work anymore. None of us could. The mansion, once a place of luxury, had become a nightmare. Around midnight, I heard a scream. It was Leah. I ran down the hall, my heart racing, and burst into her room. She was standing by the window, trembling, her face pale as a sheet. She pointed outside, but when I looked, there was nothing there. Just the empty forest, dark and silent. "It was there," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It was right there." Ethan and Mark came rushing in, and we all stood there in silence, unsure of what to do. I could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear that had been growing inside me since the day we arrived. "We need to leave," Ethan said finally, his voice barely audible. None of us argued. We grabbed what little we had and made our way downstairs, trying to be as quiet as possible. But when we reached the front door, Mr. Conrad was waiting for us, his arms crossed, a cold smile on his face. "I'm afraid you can't leave," he said. The confrontation was quick and brutal. Ethan lunged at him, but Mr. Conrad was ready. He pulled a small gun from his jacket and aimed it at us, his eyes cold and calculating. "You've been chosen," he said. "Mr. Craymore has great plans for you." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Where's Marie? What have you done to her?" He didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for us to go back upstairs. "You will understand soon enough," he said. But Ethan wasn't having it. He lunged at Mr. Conrad again, and this time, he managed to knock the gun from his hand. Chaos erupted. Leah screamed. Mark tackled Mr. Conrad, and I grabbed the gun. I don't know what came over me, but in that moment, I pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot echoed through the mansion, and Mr. Conrad fell to the ground, clutching his chest. For a moment, everything was silent. Then Leah started sobbing. We didn't have time to think. We bolted for the door, leaving Mr. Conrad's body behind, and ran into the night. The forest was thick and disorienting, the trees pressing in from all sides as we stumbled through the darkness. The oppressive silence swallowed the sound of our footsteps. Every now and then, I could hear the faint clicking noise, the same one that had haunted the mansion, but now it was following us through the trees. We didn't stop. I don't know how long we ran, but eventually, we reached a road. It was empty, no cars in sight. We followed it, desperate and exhausted, until we came across a small gas station. The attendant looked at us like we were insane. The attendant let us use the phone to call for help, and soon enough, the police arrived. They found Mr. Conrad's body in the mansion, but there was no sign of Richard Craymore. The cameras had been disconnected, and the tapes were missing. It was as though the entire estate had been abandoned for years. The authorities combed through every room, every corner, but there was no trace of the figure I had seen, or anything out of the ordinary. They chalked it up to a tragic accident. An eccentric billionaire's assistant had gone rogue, perhaps lost his mind. But I knew better. We all did. The police took us to the nearest hospital and treated us for shock. But no one could explain what had really happened. The nightmares didn't stop. Even as the weeks passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Late at night, I would hear the clicking sound again, faint and persistent. Whenever I looked in the mirror, I couldn't help but feel like there was something just behind me, out of sight, waiting. The authorities never found Marie. They never found any trace of what happened to her, and no one could tell us what Craymore's true intentions had been. But one thing is certain. We were not the first to be trapped in that mansion, and we won't be the last. The residency may be over, but the nightmare isn't. It never truly ended. Next story. It's strange how easily the mind gets trapped in routine. Day after day, I would sit in my cramped apartment, the dim glow of my computer screen reflecting off the cracked walls. My world had shrunk to that tiny desk in the corner of my living room. The hum of the computer fan and the soft click of the keys, my only company. The city outside New York was alive with its usual chaos, but inside, it was as if time stood still. I suppose that's what drew me into the dark corners of the internet. In a city full of noise, I found comfort in the anonymous silence of online forums and chat rooms. I could be anyone, say anything, without consequences. It felt empowering in a way that real life didn't. I wasn't a nobody anymore, some tech support guy struggling to make rent. Online, I could be something more. It started innocently enough. I would spend hours scrolling through Reddit, commenting on random threads, arguing with strangers over politics, video games, or whatever else happened to catch my interest. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just something to fill the emptiness that had crept into my life. But then, I found something new. A private forum buried deep within the web. A place where people gathered to share their darkest thoughts, their angriest rants. It was toxic, sure, but it was also addictive. I began to post there regularly, my comments growing more aggressive as time went on. The angrier I got, the more attention I received. It was exhilarating. That's when I started trolling. At first, it was just a game. I'd find a random person online, someone minding their own business. I'd start leaving nasty comments on their posts. It was harmless, or so I told myself. I wasn't really hurting anyone. They didn't know who I was, and I'd never meet them in real life. It was just words on a screen. But that's where I was wrong. It all changed the night I targeted the wrong person. I had come across her profile on one of the forums, a woman in her late 20s, who seemed to live a quiet life. She lived a quiet life in Chicago. Her posts were mundane, photos of her cat, updates about her job at a coffee shop, and occasional rants about her bad days. There was nothing special about her, nothing that stood out, and that made her the perfect target. I thought it would be easy, just another online sparring match, where I could push buttons and get a rise out of someone. I started by leaving simple comments, mocking her pictures, making fun of her job. It was nothing she hadn't seen before, I'm sure. The internet was full of jerks like me, after all. But instead of ignoring it or blocking me, she responded. She fought back. Her replies were sharp, cutting in a way that took me by surprise. Most people just crumbled or blocked me after a few rounds, but she didn't. She seemed to relish the back. Each of her responses was more biting than the last. It wasn't long before our exchange escalated into something more personal. I found myself spending more time tracking her posts, leaving nastier comments, digging into her life. It felt like a battle, a game I had to win. Then one day, I crossed the line. I found her personal Facebook account, buried in a link from one of her older posts. From there, I learned her real name, her workplace, even the neighborhood where she lived. I didn't think twice before I used that information against her. I left a comment on one of her photos. Asterisk, nice cat. Too bad someone might pay you a visit at 524 East Street. Asterisk, I expected her to panic, to block me, maybe even delete her account. But instead, she replied, I know who you are. My stomach lurched. It wasn't the response I had expected. It was unsettling, as if she had stripped away the anonymity I had hidden behind for so long. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, frozen. How could she possibly know who I was? I'd taken every precaution. I'd used a VPN, fake emails, everything to make sure no one could trace me. I tried to brush it off, but something about her message stuck with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a mistake, that I had underestimated her. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise in my apartment seemed louder than usual. The creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of the traffic outside. I checked my computer, refreshing the forum every few minutes, waiting for her to post something else. But she didn't. I told myself it was just a coincidence. She was bluffing. There was no way she could know who I was. But a part of me wasn't so sure anymore. The following day, things got worse. I woke up to an email in my inbox. The subject line was blank, but the sender was her name. Panic gripped me as I opened it, half expecting to see some sort of legal threat, or maybe a message telling me she had reported me. Instead, it was just a single sentence. I told you, I know who you are. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering in my chest. How did she get my email? I had used an alias for everything online, a fake name, an email that couldn't be traced back to me. I quickly scanned my computer for any sign of a hack, ran every security program I could think of, but nothing came up. Everything seemed normal. And yet, there was her email, sitting in my inbox. It mocked me. My nerves were shot, and I couldn't concentrate on anything that day. At work, I kept checking my phone, refreshing my inbox, waiting for something else to happen. But there was nothing. No new emails, no messages, just silence. Maybe she was done, I thought. Maybe it was just a scare tactic. But deep down, I knew better. That night, as I sat at my desk, I noticed something strange. My computer, which had been running smoothly all day, started to slow down, the cursor lagging as I moved the mouse. It felt like someone else was controlling it. I tried to restart the system, but it wouldn't shut down. My heart raced as I disconnected from the internet, thinking that might solve the issue. Suddenly, a message popped up on my screen. "I'm closer than you think." My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't even opened the browser, hadn't connected to the forum. It was just my desktop. But somehow, the message was there, staring back at me in bold, white letters. A chill ran down my spine. I unplugged the computer completely, the screen going dark as I sat back in my chair, heart pounding in my ears. This wasn't just some online spat anymore. It had become something far more terrifying. She wasn't just a stranger on the internet. She had somehow gotten into my life, breached the walls I thought were impenetrable. For the next hour, I sat in my apartment, the silence suffocating. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every creak of the floorboards sent a jolt of fear through me. I knew I needed to calm down, to think rationally, but that sense of security I once had was gone. The anonymity I had taken for granted was gone. And then, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You should check the door." I froze, my blood turning to ice. I hadn't told anyone my number. I hadn't shared it on any forum or website. How did she know? How did she have this kind of access? Reluctantly, I stood up, my legs trembling as I walked to the front door. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I reached for the doorknob, half expecting someone to be standing on the other side. Slowly, I turned the knob and opened the door. There was nothing, just the empty hallway of my apartment building. But taped to the door, at eye level, was a single piece of paper with 2 words written in neat, black ink. Too late, I slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking hands. This was real. She wasn't just some internet troll. She was in my life, in my head, and no matter what I did, I couldn't get away from her. I barely slept that night. Every noise outside my window, every creak in the hallway sent waves of panic through me. I kept my phone by my side, waiting for another text or another email, but nothing came. The silence was even worse. It felt like I was being hunted. It felt like she was out there, watching and waiting for me to make the next move. In the morning, I decided enough was enough. I packed a bag and left the apartment, taking the train out of the city to a small motel a few hours away. I needed to be somewhere she couldn't find me, somewhere I could think clearly and figure out what to do. I was sure she wouldn't follow me. She couldn't know where I was going. I hadn't told anyone. The motel room was small and dingy, the kind of place no one would think to look for me. I locked the door and drew the curtains, my heart still racing as I sat on the bed, trying to calm my nerves. I hadn't brought my computer, hadn't logged into any accounts. I thought that might stop her from getting to me. But the fear didn't go away. It was midday when I finally felt a little more at ease. I tried to tell myself that I was overreacting, that she couldn't possibly know where I was. Maybe it had all been a fluke. Maybe I had let things get too far inside my head. But then, my phone buzzed again. Another text from the same unknown number. Running won't help. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking. I hadn't told anyone where I was. I hadn't logged in, hadn't made a call. How did she know? How was she still tracking me? I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who I could trust. The police, what would I tell them? That some woman I had trolled online was now stalking me, hacking into my life. It sounded insane, even to me. The phone buzzed again. Room 207. My blood turned to ice. I was in room 207. I bolted out of the bed, rushing to the door. I pressed my ear against it, listening for any sounds outside, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. I grabbed the chair from the corner of the room and wedged it under the doorknob, my hands trembling as I backed away. My phone buzzed once more. It's too late. I stared at the screen, unable to breathe. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in around me. I looked around for something, anything I could use to defend myself, but all I had was a lamp and my phone. My phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with a new message. Check the mirror. With a shaking hand, I slowly turned to face the mirror on the wall. Written across the glass, in the same neat, black ink, were the same words. The same 2 words I had seen taped to my door. Too late. I backed away, my mind spinning, trying to figure out how this was happening. My phone fell from my hands, the screen shattering as it hit the floor. My breath was shallow, panic taking over. And then, the door handle began to turn. I froze, staring at the door as it rattled against the chair I had wedged beneath it. My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears as I waited, too terrified to move. The handle turned again, this time more forcefully. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think. But the door didn't open. After what felt like an eternity, the rattling stopped, and the hallway fell silent once more. I waited, my heart still pounding in my chest, unsure if she was gone. Minutes passed. The tension in the room began to fade. Slowly, I moved toward the door, my legs trembling beneath me. I pressed my ear against it, listening for any sign of movement. Nothing. I reached down, pulled the chair away from the door, and carefully unlocked it. The hallway outside was empty. I never saw her again, but I know she's still out there, watching, waiting. And no matter where I go, I can't escape the feeling that she's always one step ahead, just waiting for me to let my guard down. After the door rattled, and then fell silent, I waited, still frozen by fear. My mind raced through the possibilities of what had just happened. Was she really there? Or was this some elaborate psychological game? I paced the room for hours. Too scared to leave, but equally terrified to stay. My phone lay shattered on the floor, its last message still burning in my mind. Too late, but I couldn't just sit there. I had to do something. I had to understand how this nightmare had spiraled out of control. There was no way she could track me this accurately. No way she could know I was here, unless someone close to me knew. The realization struck me like a blow to the gut. There was someone helping her. Someone who knew me. Someone close. I grabbed my bag and decided to leave the motel. I couldn't stay there another minute. As I reached for the door, I stopped. A name flashed in my mind, one that sent a chill down my spine. Jason. My friend. The one person I'd told about my trolling habit. Jason was the one who had always laughed it off, saying it was just a game. The one who always seemed to be online at the same time, watching, lurking. Could Jason have been behind this all along? I left the motel quickly and headed back toward the train station. My hands were trembling, and my thoughts were in disarray, but I knew I needed to confront him. I had to be sure. I called Jason as soon as I had signal again, the phone ringing in my ear as I boarded the train. The call connected after a few rings, and his familiar voice came through, casual as ever. "Hey man, where have you been? We missed you at the bar last night." His words hit me like a slap. The bar. He had mentioned it in his texts. It was so innocent, so perfectly timed, and yet now, with this new perspective, it felt wrong. My pulse quickened, and I swallowed hard before speaking. "Jason, I need to ask you something. Did you ever talk to anyone about me? About the stuff I've done online?" There was a pause, a brief but telling silence that sent my heart into overdrive. "Why would I do that?" he asked, but his tone had shifted slightly. I had known Jason for years. I could tell when something was off. I pressed harder. "Did you tell anyone about the trolling? About her?" Another pause. This one longer. "You're getting paranoid," he said finally, but his voice had lost its casual charm. "Maybe you've spent too much time on those forums. You're freaking out over nothing." But it wasn't nothing. I could hear it now, the tension in his voice, the slight defensiveness. The pieces started falling into place. Jason had always known about my habits online. He had even joked about it with me, encouraging me to mess with people, telling me it was all part of the internet game. But this wasn't a game anymore. Jason, I said quietly. "How do you know where I am right now?" Another silence, this one heavy and suffocating. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Because I've always known." My stomach dropped. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I sat there, staring at my phone, the world spinning around me. Jason wasn't just a friend. He had been part of this the entire time. He had fed her information, orchestrated the entire nightmare, and had been playing both sides, watching as I unraveled. I felt sick. My entire world had been turned upside down, and I had no one to trust. I had been manipulated by someone I had called a friend for years. But why? What had I done to deserve this? I didn't go back to the city. I didn't call Jason again. The police wouldn't believe me if I told them a story about an online troll turned real-life stalker, especially with no proof other than a few cryptic messages and a shattered phone. Jason had made sure to cover his tracks. She, the woman I had trolled, was just a pawn in whatever twisted game he had been playing. For days, I stayed in hiding, moving from one cheap motel to another, constantly looking over my shoulder. I deleted my online profiles, abandoned my forums, and disconnected from everything that had once felt so familiar. But the paranoia never left me. Every time my phone buzzed, I panicked. Every time I saw a stranger glance my way, I felt that same creeping dread return. I thought about confronting Jason in person, about forcing him to explain why he had done this. But I couldn't. The idea of facing him, knowing he had been behind it all along, was too much to bear. I had trusted him, shared my darkest habits with him, and he had used that against me. I don't know if I'll ever be safe. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that Jason is still out there, watching from the shadows, waiting for me to slip up. The internet is a vast and dangerous place, and anonymity is nothing but an illusion. I thought I was safe behind my screen, hidden in the darkness of the web, but I was wrong. There are people out there, people like Jason, who know how to pull the strings. They know how to turn the online world into a weapon, and once they have their sights set on you, there's no escaping. Next story. The hardest part about waiting was the quiet. The kind of quiet that wraps around you, thick and suffocating, where every second seems to stretch out until it feels like hours have passed. I sat next to Sarah in that sterile clinic waiting room, the buzz of fluorescent lights above us the only sound cutting through the silence. Sarah, my wife, sat beside me, her face pale, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The strain of the last few years was etched into every line on her face, and her eyes carried the weight of every disappointment we'd faced. We had been trying for nearly 3 years to conceive, 3 long years filled with tests, consultations, false hopes, and crushing letdowns. There had been times where we nearly gave up, where it seemed easier to accept the childless life that stretched before us. But then, hope would rear its head again, stubborn and unrelenting, dragging us back into the endless cycle of anticipation and heartbreak. It was that hope, or maybe desperation, that had led us to Dr. Anton Greger, a fertility specialist based in the outskirts of Boston. The clinic itself, tucked away in a quiet corner of the old financial district, was housed in a building that looked like it had been forgotten by time. Red brick, ivy climbing up the walls, and narrow windows that reminded me of eyes that watched but didn't see. The place felt out of place amid the modern skyscrapers and bustling city life. It was an island, isolated and quiet, which seemed fitting, somehow. We felt like outsiders everywhere we went these days. We had heard of Dr. Greger through a close friend, who had been in a similar position to ours. She had tried for years to conceive, and had found success at this very clinic. When she first mentioned him, I remember feeling a flicker of hope, tempered by the kind of skepticism that comes after too many failures. "It's not like the others," she had said, leaning in with a kind of intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Dr. Greger, he's different. He doesn't give up. He doesn't fail. The words had stuck with me, gnawing at the back of my mind like a persistent itch that refused to go away. We made an appointment, more out of desperation than belief, and here we were, sitting in that dim waiting room, waiting for our names to be called. Sarah shifted beside me, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. I could feel her anxiety radiating off her in waves, and it mirrored my own. There was something unsettling about the place. Maybe it was the stillness of the room, the faded, old-fashioned, that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. Or maybe it was the way the receptionist barely made eye contact with us when we walked in. Whatever it was, it left me feeling uneasy, like we had crossed into a place where we didn't belong. The door to the back of the clinic opened with a soft creak, and Dr. Gregor stepped into the room. He was tall, with graying hair that was neatly combed back, and he wore a pair of thin, wire-rimmed glasses that caught the light in strange ways. He smiled, a thin, professional smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and gestured for us to follow him. The consultation room was just as outdated as the waiting area, with faded wallpaper and old wooden furniture that looked like it had been there for decades. Dr. Gregor didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He sat behind his desk, hands folded neatly in front of him, and asked us to explain our situation. "We've been trying for 3 years," Sarah said, her voice small and tired. "We've tried everything. Medications, treatments, IVF, but nothing's worked." Dr. Gregor nodded, as though he had heard the story 1,000 times before. "And now you're here." It wasn't a question. "We were told that you specialize in cases like ours," I said, glancing at Sarah. "That you have ways of helping couples who've tried everything." Dr. Gregor leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he regarded us with a cool, clinical gaze. "I do," he said. "My methods are unorthodox, but they have proven remarkably effective. I work with techniques that push the boundaries of what conventional medicine allows." He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. "Of course, with such experimental methods, there are risks, but nothing that I believe outweighs the potential for success." My breath caught in my throat. "Risks?" He waved a hand dismissively. "Every medical procedure comes with risks, Mr. Alex," I said, "and this is Sarah." "Well, Alex, the risks are mostly mild discomfort, fatigue, nausea. But in some cases, the pregnancy may trigger more unusual reactions in the body. Nothing that can't be managed with the proper care." The way he said it made my skin crawl, but Sarah's hand slipped into mine, squeezing tightly. She wanted this. We both did. We had come too far to turn back now. After a long moment of silence, I nodded. "What do we have to do?" Dr. Gregor smiled, but there was something about that smile. Something that didn't quite fit. "Just leave it to me." We signed the papers. We agreed to the treatments. We put our faith in a man we barely knew, because what else could we do? Desperation has a way of clouding judgment. The treatments started immediately. It wasn't like anything we had gone through before. The medications were different, the injections more intense, but Dr. Gregor assured us it was necessary. That his methods were what made him successful, and at first, it seemed to be working. Sarah's body responded to the treatments faster than it ever had. Within weeks, she was pregnant. The first few months were a blur of joy and cautious optimism. For the first time in years, Sarah had a glow about her, a kind of quiet happiness that had been missing for so long. The nausea, the fatigue, all of it seemed like a small price to pay for the life we had dreamed of. But as time went on, things began to change. It started with the rash. One morning, as I was getting ready for work, Sarah called me from the bedroom. Her voice had a strange tone to it, tense-certain, worried. I rushed to her side, finding her standing in front of the mirror, her shirt pulled up to reveal her growing belly. At first, I didn't see it, but then she turned slightly. My heart skipped a beat. There, just beneath the skin, was a faint network of veins, dark, almost bluish veins that seemed to spider out from her navel. It looked like something out of a medical textbook, a picture of blood vessels that shouldn't be visible. Not like that. It itches, she said, her fingers hovering just above the skin, as if she didn't want to touch it. I didn't know what to say. My mind raced with possible explanations, stretch marks, pregnancy hormones, maybe even an allergic reaction. It's probably nothing, I said, my voice sounding more confident than I felt. But let's call Dr. Gregor, just in case. We called the clinic, and the nurse on the other end of the line sounded unconcerned. It's a normal side effect, she said in a monotone voice, as though she had said it 100 times before. Nothing to worry about, but it didn't feel normal. Over the next few days, the veins grew darker, more pronounced. Sarah tried to ignore it, tried to stay positive, but I could see the worry creeping into her eyes. The rash spread slowly, crawling up her sides and around her back, until it looked like her entire torso was crisscrossed with dark lines. And the itching, she said the itching was unbearable. Like something beneath the skin was trying to claw its way out. Dr. Gregor assured us again that it was nothing. Some patients experience more visible side effects than others, he said. It's a reaction to the medication. It will pass. But it didn't pass. The symptoms only got worse. Sarah began to complain of sharp pains, stabbing pains that would come and go without warning. They started in her abdomen but soon spread to her legs, arms, and even her chest. She would double over in agony, clutching her stomach, her face twisted in pain. There were nights when I would wake up to find her sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands pressed to her belly, her eyes wide and glassy. It feels like something's moving, she whispered one night, her voice trembling with fear. I tried to reassure her. I tried to tell her that it was normal for a baby to move around, but deep down, I felt the same growing fear. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones, in the pit of my stomach. But we were too far in. We had already committed, and every time I called the clinic, every time I tried to express my concerns, I was met with the same calm, detached responses. Everything is progressing as expected. Don't worry, Mr. Alex. This is all part of the process. But the process wasn't supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to feel like we were losing control, like we had handed our lives over to something far beyond our understanding. The fear that had started as a small ember was now growing into a full-blown inferno, burning away the thin veneer of normalcy. One night, about 5 months into the pregnancy, Sarah woke me in a panic. I could hear her ragged breaths, even before my eyes opened. When I sat up, I saw her standing in front of the full-length mirror, on the far side of our room. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across her body. But even in the dim light, I could see the changes happening to her. Her belly was unnaturally large, far bigger than it should have been at 5 months. The veins beneath her skin, the ones that had started as a faint rash, were now prominent, thick like black cords crisscrossing her body. Her skin had taken on an almost translucent quality, and I could see the outline of something shifting beneath the surface. Her hands trembled as she touched her belly, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, a ripple, like a shadow moving just beneath her skin. "Alex," she whispered, her voice strained and on the verge of breaking. "It's not just the baby. There's something else. I can feel it. It's moving differently. It doesn't feel right." I got out of bed, my heart hammering in my chest. Every rational part of me wanted to tell her that she was imagining things, that the stress and hormones were playing tricks on her mind, but I couldn't. I couldn't shake the knowing feeling that something was terribly, horribly wrong. I walked over to her, wrapping my arms around her shoulders as she trembled. Her skin was cold to the touch, clammy with sweat. "We'll go to the clinic tomorrow," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "We'll make them do something." She nodded, her body stiff against mine, but I could feel the doubt in her, the same doubt that had been growing inside me for weeks. What could we do? We had signed the papers. agreed to the treatments, and put our faith in Dr. Gregor. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in bed, listening to Sarah's shallow breathing as she lay beside me, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. I stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster, waiting for the first light of dawn to push back the shadows that seemed to be creeping in around us. The next day, we went back to the clinic. I had called ahead, demanding an immediate appointment, refusing to take no for an answer. Sarah was in too much pain to protest, her body visibly deteriorating with each passing hour. Her skin had taken on a sickly pallor, and dark circles had formed under her eyes. She was losing weight despite the pregnancy, her cheeks hollow, her bones jutting out in sharp angles. The baby, or whatever was inside her, seemed to be draining the life out of her. When we arrived at the clinic, Dr. Gregor was waiting for us, his calm, controlled demeanor as unnerving as ever. He ushered us into a private examination room, the kind that smelled of antiseptic and cold metal. The room was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring and your heart race. "We're going to run some tests," Dr. Gregor said, his voice smooth and clinical. "I assure you, everything is progressing as expected." I couldn't take it anymore. The anger that had been building inside me boiled over. "Expected," I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. "Look at her. This is not normal. She's in pain. She's dying. What have you done to her?" Dr. Gregor remained unflinching, his eyes fixed on me with an eerie calm. "I understand your concern, Mr. Alex, but I assure you, everything is under control." "No," I said, shaking my head. "It's not. You've been lying to us. You've been hiding things from us." "I want the truth. Now." For the first time, something shifted in Dr. Gregor's expression. It was subtle, a flicker of something dark in his eyes, a tightening of his lips. He glanced at Sarah, who was now lying on the examination table, her breath coming in shallow gasps, before turning his attention back to me. "There are things you don't understand," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "The treatment you agreed to, it's not just about fertility. It's about evolution, progress." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "What are you talking about?" Dr. Gregor took a step closer to me, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We are on the cusp of something incredible, Mr. Alex. Something that will change the very fabric of humanity. Your child, Sarah's child, is the first step in that process." I stared at him, my mind struggling to comprehend what he was saying. "You're experimenting on us." He didn't deny it. Instead, he smiled, a cold, calculated smile that made my blood run cold. "Your child is not just a child, Mr. Alex. It is a breakthrough, a new form of life. Something beyond what we currently understand." I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, my heart pounding in my ears. "You're insane," I whispered. "You've put something inside her, something that isn't human." Dr. Gregor's smile widened. "Not yet, but it will be." Before I could react, the door to the examination room opened, and two nurses entered, their faces blank, expressionless. They moved toward Sarah, who was too weak to resist, and began preparing her for some kind of procedure. "No," I shouted, rushing toward the table. "Don't touch her." One of the nurses grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Sir, please, step back." I struggled, trying to pull away, but the nurse's grip tightened. "Let me go," I shouted, panic rising in my throat. Dr. Gregor watched calmly from the corner of the room, his hands folded behind his back. "You need to trust me, Mr. Alex. Everything I'm doing is for the greater good." "Greater good," I spat, my voice trembling with rage. "You're killing her." Before I could say anything else, I felt a sharp prick in my arm. One of the nurses had injected me with something that made the world blur around the edges, my limbs growing heavy and sluggish. I tried to fight it, tried to keep my eyes open, but the darkness swallowed me whole. When I woke up, the room was dim, and my body felt like it had been submerged in molasses. I could hear the soft beeping of machines, the sterile hum of medical equipment, but I couldn't move. My limbs were heavy, my mind foggy. Slowly, as my vision cleared, I realized I was strapped to a chair, my wrists and ankles bound with thick leather straps. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't move. I could barely even speak. Across the room, Sarah lay on the examination table, her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The veins beneath her skin had darkened even further, now pulsing with a strange, almost luminescent light. Her belly had swollen even more, grotesquely large, as if something inside her was pushing its way out. Dr. Gregor stood beside her, watching her with the cold, detached gaze of a scientist observing his experiment. The nurses were gone, and the room felt eerily quiet, save for the faint beeping of the machines monitoring Sarah's vital signs. "She's nearing the final stage," Dr. Gregor said softly, almost to himself. "It's almost time." "Time for what?" I managed to croak, my voice weak and hoarse. Dr. Gregor glanced at me, raising an eyebrow. "For the birth, of course. The culmination of all my work. Your child will be the first of many, Mr. Alex. The beginning of a new era." I struggled against the restraints, my muscles straining, but I was too weak. "You can't do this," I gasped. "You're playing God, and you're going to kill her." "She's a vessel," Dr. Gregor said simply, as if that explained everything. "A means to an end." Sarah understood that, even if she didn't realize it. My vision blurred again, tears of rage and helplessness clouding my eyes. I had been a fool to trust him, a fool to believe in his promises. I had brought Sarah here, and now I was watching her die. Suddenly, Sarah's body convulsed, her back arching off the table as a guttural scream tore from her throat. The machines around her beeped frantically, the monitors flashing with erratic readings. Dr. Gregor moved quickly, checking the machines, his movements calm and methodical, as if he had been expecting this. "Ah," he said, almost sounding pleased. "It's happening." I watched in horror as Sarah's belly bulged unnaturally, the skin stretching and distorting as something moved beneath it, something large, something alive. Her screams filled the room, echoing off the walls, and I felt a sickening sense of helplessness wash over me. "Stop it," I shouted, my voice breaking. "Please, stop it." Dr. Gregor didn't even look at me. His focus remained on Sarah, on the grotesque transformation happening before our eyes. Her body convulsed violently now, her screams guttural and raw, as if they were being torn from her soul. I strained against the leather straps, desperate to free myself, desperate to help her, but my body was too weak. The drugs they had injected into me still coursed through my veins, dulling my muscles, blurring my mind. Suddenly, Sarah's convulsions stopped. The room fell eerily silent, save for the faint beeping of the machines. Her body lay still on the table, her chest barely rising and falling, her once glowing skin now deathly pale. For a moment, I thought she was gone, that whatever horror had taken hold of her had finally consumed her. But then, I saw it. A movement, slow at first, but unmistakable. Her belly rippled, the skin stretching unnaturally. And then something pressed against it from the inside. I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was as if someone, was trying to push its way out of her, like a hand pressing up against a veil, straining to break free. The skin bulged and stretched, and I could see every detail, the shape of fingers, of an arm, of something far too large to be human. My breath caught in my throat. I realized that this thing was coming. It was coming now. Dr. Gregor stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of excitement and awe. "This is it," he whispered, as if he were witnessing a miracle, the birth of the future. Sarah's body twitched, her back arching once more, and then, with a sickening wet sound, her belly split open. The room filled with the scent of blood and fluids. I felt bile rise in my throat. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I had to see. I had to know. From the torn flesh of her abdomen, something emerged. At first, it was difficult to make out, slick with blood, its limbs twisting in unnatural ways as it pulled itself free from Sarah's body. But as it fully emerged, standing in the dim light of the examination room, I could see it clearly. It was a child. At least, it had the shape of one. But it was wrong. Horribly, grotesquely wrong. Its limbs were elongated, too thin and too long. Its skin an unnatural shade of pale gray. Its eyes, those eyes, were black, bottomless pits. Too large for its face, like dark voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. The veins that had covered Sarah's body were etched into its skin, pulsing with a faint, sickly glow. The thing, my child, if I could even call it that, stumbled forward, dripping with blood, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being yanked on invisible strings. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, it stared at me, its dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I felt like I was drowning in that gaze, like it was reaching into my soul, pulling at the deepest parts of me. For a long moment, the creature just stood there, staring at me, and I realized with a sickening sense of dread that it was aware. It was alive, and it knew who I was. Dr. Gregor moved toward it, his hands outstretched as if to welcome it. "Magnificent," he breathed, his voice trembling with reverence. "You see, Mr. Alex, this is the future. This is evolution. A new kind of life, one that will surpass humanity. Your child is the first of its kind." I wanted to scream, to rage against him, to demand answers. But all I could do was stare, my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. This thing, this abomination, wasn't my child. It couldn't be. This wasn't what we had wanted. This wasn't what we had signed up for. But it was too late, far too late. And then, the creature did something that sent ice-cold fear shooting through my veins. It smiled. Not a human smile. Not the smile of a newborn child, but something far more sinister, far more knowing. It tilted its head to the side, studying me, and then, with a slow, deliberate movement, it turned its attention to Sarah's lifeless body. Its black eyes flickered with a strange light as it reached down, its elongated fingers brushing against her still form. "No," I croaked, my voice weak and hoarse. "Get away from her." Dr. Gregor ignored me, his focus entirely on the creature. "There's more to be done," he murmured, almost to himself. "So much more to be discovered." The creature, my child, leaned down over Sarah, its face inches from hers, and for a moment, I thought I saw something like curiosity in its expression. And then, with a sudden, violent motion, it plunged its hands into her open abdomen, pulling at the torn flesh, rooting around inside her, like a predator devouring its prey. I screamed. I screamed until my throat was raw, but no one came. No one stopped it. Dr. Gregor simply watched, his eyes gleaming with a twisted kind of joy. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, this is only the beginning." I don't remember much after that. The drugs they had injected into me must have finally taken full effect, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed. The room was white and sterile, and the hum of machines was the only sound I could hear. I sat up, my head pounding, my body aching. Sarah was gone. I knew that, without even asking. The child, the creature, it was gone too. But the memory of that night, of what I had seen, was burned into my mind. Dr. Gregor, the clinic, it had all disappeared. When I asked the nurses, the doctors, they looked at me like I was insane. They said I had been found unconscious in our apartment, alone, with no sign of Sarah. They said there was no clinic, numbered Dr. Gregor, no record of any fertility treatments. It was as if none of it had ever happened. But I knew the truth. I knew what I had seen. I knew what had been done to us. The months that followed were a blur. I tried to find answers, tried to trace the clinic, but every lead went cold. It was as if the entire place had been wiped from existence. I couldn't find any of the staff, any records, nothing. It was as though we had been part of some secret, underground experiment, and now the evidence had been erased. I moved away from Boston. I couldn't stay there, not after everything. But even now, as I sit in this new apartment, far away from the city, I can't escape the nightmares. I see Sarah every night, her body convulsing on that table, her eyes wide with terror, and I see it, that thing that had come from her, that thing that wasn't human. But the worst part, the part that haunts me the most, is that I know it's still out there. Somewhere, that creature, my child, is walking the earth, growing, learning, evolving, and I can't help but wonder what Dr. Gregor meant when he said it was just the beginning. What other horrors has he unleashed? What other experiments is he conducting, in secret, in the shadows? I will never know for sure. Next story. It was early autumn in Seattle, and the light rain had already started to settle into its usual pattern. The gray skies, the muted sound of droplets falling on rooftops, and the mist that rolled in off the sound were all as familiar to me as my own face in the mirror. For most people, the rain was a nuisance, a never-ending dreary companion that seeped into every crevice of their lives, but for me, it was a comfort. I worked from home mostly, and the gentle patter against my windows had a way of making the outside world seem distant, like a hum you could tune out. I was a journalist, freelancing for various publications, mostly true crime pieces. I'd been a fan of true crime since I was a teenager, staying up late with my flashlight under the covers, reading about famous cases, unsolved mysteries, and serial killers. It was the danger of it all that captivated me. How people could vanish from their lives, how violence could erupt in the most mundane places. Seattle had seen its fair share of violent crimes over the years, and it wasn't long before I'd started writing about them. My name is Rachel. That's all you need to know about me. I've always liked my name, common but not boring, familiar but not forgettable. It made me feel grounded. That grounding was important to me, especially with the kind of work I did. When you spend your days poring over gruesome details of people's deaths, their lives reduced to police reports and cold facts, it helps to feel anchored to something. My name was that anchor. It was late September when I first heard about the murders. They started in the south part of the city, around Tacoma. A woman was found strangled in her apartment. Nothing particularly unusual about that. It was a rough area, and violence wasn't unheard of. But then, 2 days later, another body was discovered. Another woman, same cause of death. Both women were named Rachel. The coincidence was unsettling, but I wasn't drawn in yet. It was just a story to me, something that might make for a good article. I'd written about serial killers before, and the idea of a killer with a peculiar obsession was a solid hook. But, at the time, that's all it was, a story waiting to be written. The next morning, as I sat in my kitchen sipping coffee, I scrolled through the news. The headline caught my eye immediately. Third victim in South Seattle murders, identified. I clicked the link, my stomach already twisting before I read the details. Another Rachel. 3 women, all with my name, all murdered within a week of each other. I felt a strange chill run down my spine. It was unsettling, but I didn't think I was in any danger. Why would I be? Seattle was a big city, and Rachel was a common name. There had to be hundreds of Rachels living here, probably more. I closed my laptop and pushed the thought aside, shaking off the unease as I prepared to start my day. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The coincidence was gnawing at me, tugging at the edges of my thoughts. What were the odds that 3 women with the same name would be murdered in such a short span of time? I knew better than to believe in patterns where none existed. As a journalist, I was trained to be skeptical, to look for the facts and nothing more. But something about this felt off. The names, the way they were killed, it was starting to feel deliberate. That evening, as the rain picked up again outside, I decided to do some digging. I pulled up the police reports, scouring through whatever details were available to the public. I found the names of the victims, their ages, their addresses. No other connections between them that I could see, just the name. That was the only thing they had in common. I stayed up late that night, reading everything I could find about the case. By midnight, my eyes were burning, and my head ached from staring at the screen for too long. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. The name. That name. My name. I went to bed with a pit in my stomach, trying to convince myself that it was just another story. But deep down, I knew that something had shifted. That this was more than just an eerie coincidence. It wasn't until the fourth victim that I started to panic. She was found in her car, slumped over the steering wheel in a quiet neighborhood not too far from where I lived. The news had come through my phone in the middle of the afternoon, while I was sitting at my desk trying to focus on an article deadline. My phone buzzed, and I glanced at the notification without much thought. The headline made my heart skip. Fourth victim in Seattle murders identified. Another Rachel. This one was only a few blocks away from my apartment. I could walk there in under 15 minutes. My pulse quickened, my fingers hovering above my keyboard, frozen in mid-typing. There was no denying it anymore. This was intentional. Someone was targeting women with my name, and they were getting closer. My first instinct was to call the police. I hesitated, though unsure of what to say. I wasn't in immediate danger. Not yet. There was no logical reason for me to believe I would be next. But the thought wouldn't leave me alone, creeping into the back of my mind like an unwelcome guest. I stood up from my desk, pacing the small space of my apartment. My eyes kept darting to the windows, as though expecting to see someone watching me. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the rational part of my brain, the part that usually kept me grounded, was starting to falter. I reached for my phone again, this time pulling up the number for my editor at the paper. I needed to talk to someone about this, to figure out if I was overreacting, or if I had reason to be concerned. As the phone rang, I felt a sudden wave of nausea, my palms damp with sweat. When my editor answered, I blurted it all out. The murders, the pattern, the fact that they all had my name. "You think you're in danger?" he asked, his voice a mixture of confusion and skepticism. "I don't know," I admitted. "But what are the odds? I mean, it's not just the name, it's the proximity. The fourth victim is practically my neighbor." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him weighing my words, trying to figure out if I was serious, or if this was just some kind of nervous breakdown brought on by too many late nights and too much caffeine. "Rachel," he said finally, "I think you should take a break. Step away from the case for a bit. It's probably just a coincidence." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this was all just some horrible twist of fate. That the killer didn't know who I was, and had no intention of targeting me specifically. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. Something important. "Maybe you're right," I said, though I didn't feel reassured. I hung up and stared at my phone for a long time, my thoughts spinning in circles. I needed answers, but I wasn't sure where to start. The next day, I decided to pay a visit to the last victim's neighborhood. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find. Some clue the police had overlooked. Some connection that would explain why these women were being targeted. I walked the few blocks to the street where her body had been found, the drizzle soaking through my jacket as I stood on the sidewalk, staring at her car. There was still police tape around it, though the officers were long gone. I could feel the eyes of the neighbors on me. I stood there, wondering what I was doing. I felt like an intruder, like I didn't belong. But then again, neither did the killer. He or she had brought something alien and violent into this quiet, unremarkable place. As I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. Across the street, just behind one of the houses, there was a small alley that I hadn't seen before. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a car, and it disappeared between two rows of buildings. Something about it drew me in, a nagging curiosity that I couldn't ignore. I walked toward the alley, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, probably nothing. But as I stepped into the alley, I saw something glinting in the dirt ahead. I crouched down, my hands trembling as I brushed away the debris. It was a necklace, delicate and silver, with a small charm in the shape of an R. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This was the victim's necklace. I was sure of it. But how had it ended up here, in this alley, away from the crime scene? My breath quickened as I turned the necklace over in my hands, the weight of it pressing down on me like a lead anchor. This alley felt too intimate, too purposeful. It wasn't an accidental place for something to end up. It was chosen, like the alley itself had been placed here deliberately. A narrow space hidden from view, somewhere you wouldn't find unless you were looking for it, or unless someone led you here. I looked around, my senses heightened. The rain made everything feel muted, almost dreamlike, as if I wasn't really standing in that alley at all, but was watching myself from a distance, detached from the situation. I stood up, clutching the necklace tightly in my hand. I had to leave. I knew I should go straight to the police, tell them what I had found, show them the necklace. But something held me there. It was the same instinct that had brought me to this neighborhood in the first place, the same pull that had driven me to investigate the case, even when my editor had told me to step away. The killer wasn't just targeting random women with my name. This felt personal now. The proximity to my home, the discovery of this necklace, it all made the threat feel closer, more immediate. I slid the necklace into my pocket and began to walk briskly back toward my apartment, casting nervous glances behind me every few seconds. Was someone watching me? I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone's eyes were tracking my every step, studying me the way a predator observes its prey before striking. But the street was empty, save for a couple of parked cars and the occasional pedestrian hurrying through the drizzle with their heads down. When I got home, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. My apartment felt different now, smaller and less safe. The walls seemed to close in on me as I crossed the room, pacing restlessly. I had 1,000 questions, but no answers, only a growing fear gnawing at me from the inside out. I pulled the necklace out of my pocket again, holding it up to the light. It was delicate, unremarkable in any way, except for the letter charm that dangled from it. Art. My name. It could have belonged to any Rachel, but it was here, in my hand, and that made it mine, in some strange, awful way. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the apartment, every gust of wind outside, felt like the footsteps of someone coming closer, of the killer stalking just beyond my walls. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, willing the unease to go away. I told myself, again and again, that I was being paranoid, that there was no reason to believe I was in any real danger. But the facts weighed against me. 4 victims, all with my name, all within a few miles of my apartment, and the killer was still out there. The next morning, I decided to do something I should have done days ago. I called the police. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. A detective to come rushing to my door, eager to hear what I had to say. Perhaps. Instead, I was greeted with a calm, measured voice on the other end of the line. A voice that assured me they were taking the matter seriously, and that they appreciated the information. It didn't make me feel any better, but what else could I do? The police were involved now. I'd done my part, or so I tried to convince myself. I needed to get back to work, to focus on something other than the gnawing fear that was creeping closer with each passing day. But the fear wouldn't leave. As I sat at my desk, attempting to write an article about a completely unrelated topic, my thoughts kept drifting back to the murders. the way each of the victims had been found, the pattern of their deaths, and the fact that the killer seemed to be getting closer to me with each passing day. I was next, wasn't I? The idea lodged itself in my brain, stubborn and unshakable. It was nearly evening when my phone buzzed again, the familiar jarring sound pulling me from my anxious reverie. I grabbed it quickly, my hands trembling slightly as I read the notification. Another murder. But this time, the name wasn't Rachel. I stared at the screen, confused. The latest victim, a woman in her early 30s, had been found strangled in her apartment, just like the others. But her name wasn't Rachel. It was something completely different, something ordinary. The relief I should have felt, that maybe, just maybe, the pattern had been broken, didn't come. Instead, I felt more unsettled than ever. Why had the killer deviated from the pattern? Was this some kind of mistake, or was I reading too much into the names? I couldn't tell anymore. My mind had become so fixated on the idea that I was next that I hadn't even considered the possibility that the killer might change their target. I stayed glued to the news for the next hour, watching the story unfold in real time. The victim had been found in a quiet neighborhood not far from where I had found the necklace. As the details trickled in, I felt my stomach knotting with dread. The victim's profile, her lifestyle, her daily routines, they all mirrored mine. She was a writer, working from home. She lived alone. She even frequented the same grocery store that I went to every week. And then, the twist I hadn't expected. Her middle name was Rachel. I felt my blood turn to ice. I hadn't even thought to consider middle names. All this time, I had been looking at first names, obsessing over the idea that the killer was fixated on women named Rachel. But now, I realized that the pattern was deeper than that. The killer wasn't just targeting first names. They were targeting women whose middle names were Rachel as well. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. The previous victims, had their middle names been Rachel too? I hadn't bothered to check. Why would I have? But now, it seemed so obvious. I opened my laptop and began searching through the public records, combing through the profiles of each victim. My heart pounded in my chest. My hands shook as I clicked from one page to the next. Sure enough, every single one of them had Rachel as either their first or middle name. I was right. The killer was targeting women with my name, but it wasn't just the name. It was the identity, the person behind it. The pattern wasn't as random as I had thought. The killer wasn't just choosing victims at random. They were following a specific, calculated pattern. I shut my laptop and leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. What did this mean? Was I still in danger? Or had the killer already moved on to someone else? I didn't know. But one thing was clear. I needed to be careful. The pattern was still unfolding, and I had no idea where it would lead next. The days that followed felt like a blur. I found myself caught between two worlds, trying to live as usual, while constantly looking over my shoulder. I was waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. The killer was still out there, and I had no idea when or where they would strike next. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the murders stopped. Weeks went by, and no new victims were found. The police investigation continued, but there were no new leads, no arrests. The city moved on, as cities always do. The story faded from the headlines, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The pattern had been broken, but it felt incomplete, unfinished. There were still too many unanswered questions. I tried to put it behind me, to move on with my life. But the fear lingered, like a shadow that followed me everywhere I went. Every time I stepped outside, I felt exposed and vulnerable. Every time I heard a strange noise in the night, my heart would race, and I would lie awake, listening and waiting. It wasn't until months later that I found the final piece of the puzzle. I had been going through some old family documents, organizing papers for a freelance project I was working on, when I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. It was a birth certificate, tucked away in a folder of old paperwork. My birth certificate, there, printed clearly in black ink, was my full name. Rachel, Emily. I stared at it, my mind racing. Emily. My middle name wasn't Rachel. It never had been. The realization hit me like a freight train. I wasn't the target. I had never been the target. The killer had been after someone else all along. Someone whose full name was Rachel. Someone who shared more than just a first name. The pattern I had been so obsessed with had never included me. I had been on the outside of it the whole time, watching it unfold without ever truly understanding it. I wasn't the killer's next victim. I was just a spectator. The relief that flooded through me was overwhelming, but it was quickly followed by a deep, gnawing sense of unease. If I wasn't the target, then who was? And why had the killings stopped? I never found out. The police never caught the killer, and the case eventually went cold. The murders faded from memory, a footnote in the city's long history of unsolved crimes. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't shake the feeling that the pattern wasn't truly broken, that the killer was still out there, waiting to strike again. Every time I saw a news report about a woman found dead, I would hold my breath, waiting for the name. Was she another Rachel? Was it part of the same pattern? But it never was. The killings seemed to have stopped for good. For months, I tried to convince myself that it was over, that the threat had passed. But something wouldn't let me rest. It wasn't just the murders that haunted me. It was the silence that followed. The quiet after the storm, the absence of answers. The killer had vanished as quickly as they had appeared, and I was left with nothing but questions. Why had the murders stopped? Had the killer been arrested for some other crime? Had they died? Or were they simply biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to start again? The thought gnawed at me. The thought that the killer was still out there, possibly living an ordinary life, blending in with the rest of us, gnawed at me. How could someone who had caused so much terror just disappear? The police had moved on. Their focus shifted to other cases, other crimes. I was told to move on, My editor, sympathetic but firm, suggested that I take a break from writing true crime. "It's clearly affecting you," he said during one of our phone calls. "Why don't you try something different for a while? Maybe a feature on local businesses, or something lighter." I agreed, though the thought of writing about coffee shops or boutique stores felt hollow and meaningless. I tried to follow his advice, to focus on the mundane, to push the darkness away, but it was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, like the fog that crept in off the sound, seeping into the corners of my mind. I started walking more, hoping that fresh air and exercise would clear my thoughts. Seattle had beautiful parks, lush with trees and winding paths that made you forget, for a moment, that you were in the middle of a city. I took comfort in the quiet of nature, the rhythm of my footsteps. The steady rhythm of my footsteps on the gravel, the occasional bird call, breaking the silence. One day, during one of these walks, I found myself in a park I hadn't visited before. It was tucked away in an older part of the city, a neighborhood filled with charming, weathered houses and narrow streets lined with towering, moss-covered trees. The park itself was small, more of a green space than a full park. There were a few benches and a playground that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I sat down on one of the benches, taking in the stillness around me. I was just starting to relax when I noticed something. At first, it was just a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. I turned my head, scanning the park, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just joggers, dog walkers, families. The usual mix of joggers and dog walkers, the occasional family pushing a stroller. I shook it off, telling myself that my nerves were still raw, that I was seeing things that weren't there. But then, I saw it again, a figure, standing just beyond the tree line, partially obscured by the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but something about the way they stood made my skin crawl. The stillness of it, the way they seemed to be watching, made my skin crawl. I stood up from the bench, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, just someone out for a walk like me, maybe pausing to admire the trees. But the unease was back, stronger than ever. I started walking toward the park's exit, trying to keep my pace steady and casual, but I felt those eyes. I could feel the figure's eyes on me, tracking my movements, following me as I made my way toward the street. Once I was back on the sidewalk, I glanced over my shoulder. The figure was gone. I hurried home, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. It was probably nothing, just a trick of the light, or my imagination playing tricks on me after everything that had happened. But I couldn't shake the sense that the pattern wasn't truly over. The killer hadn't disappeared, but was simply waiting, watching from the shadows. That night, I had trouble sleeping again. Every creak of the apartment, every whisper of wind outside my window felt like a threat. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. Something wasn't right. I tried to tell myself that it was just the aftermath of everything, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next few days passed in a blur of anxious energy. I tried to keep myself busy, throwing myself into my work, but I couldn't focus. The feeling of being watched hadn't left. It followed me wherever I went. On my walks, in the grocery store, even in my own apartment, I found myself checking the locks on my doors and windows multiple times a day, convinced that someone was out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, one evening, as I was sitting on the couch, I heard it. A soft knock at the door. I froze, my heart racing. It was late, far too late for visitors. I hadn't ordered anything, and I wasn't expecting anyone. My mind raced through the possibilities. Was it a neighbor? A package delivery? Or was it something else? Something darker? The knock came again, louder this time. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking as I made my way toward the door. I pressed my eye to the peephole, half expecting to see nothing, or worse, someone standing there, faceless and unknown. But when I looked, the hallway was empty. There was no one there. I stepped back from the door, my breath catching in my throat. My hands were trembling as I reached for the deadbolt, locking it securely. I didn't know what to think. Had I imagined it? Or had someone really knocked and then disappeared? I sat back down on the couch, trying to calm myself, but the unease had turned into full-blown panic. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been out there was still watching, still waiting. The next day, I decided to do something I had been avoiding for weeks. I went back to the police. I needed to talk to someone about the lingering fear, the feeling that the killer wasn't truly gone. The officer at the station listened patiently as I explained everything, how the murders had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still in danger. He nodded, made a few notes. He assured me that they would keep an eye on things, but I could tell that he didn't really believe me. To him, I was just another person spooked by a string of violent crimes, someone who had let their imagination get the best of them. I left the station feeling more alone than ever. Weeks passed, and the feeling of being watched gradually faded. I went back to my normal routine. I was more cautious than I had been before. I kept my windows locked, my doors bolted. I stayed away from the parks and neighborhoods where the murders had taken place. Life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. But then, one night, months after the last murder, I received a letter. It was unmarked, with no return address, just a plain white envelope that had been slipped through the mail slot of my apartment door. I opened it cautiously, my hands trembling as I pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. The message was short, written in neat, blocky handwriting. I haven't forgotten you, Rachel. I stared at the words, my blood turning to ice. There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it, but I knew it was from the killer. They hadn't forgotten. The pattern hadn't been broken after all. They had simply been waiting, biding their time, watching me. The fear I had been living with for so long flooded back, stronger than ever. I felt like a mouse trapped in a cage, with the cat circling just outside, waiting for the right moment to pounce. I called the police again, but there was little they could do. There were no fingerprints, no way to trace the letter, and so I waited. Days turned into weeks, then months. The letter sat on my desk, a constant reminder that the threat was still out there, lurking just beyond the edges of my life. I tried to go on with my life, but the fear was always there, lurking in the background, like a shadow that never quite goes away. I had survived, but I hadn't escaped. The killer was still out there, somewhere, watching and waiting. And I knew, deep down, that they would strike again. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. And when they did, I would be ready. Next story. I don't really know how I ended up at Blood Ridge. I'd like to say it was because I needed to clear my head, or that I was running away from something. But the truth is, I'd always been fascinated by the stories, the urban legends. They lingered around the place like a fog, whispers of something dark and unsettling that no one could quite explain. Blood Ridge wasn't the kind of place people talked about openly. You'd hear things in the local bars, muttered between gulps of beer, or in the knowing glance of an old-timer. The kind of place that had stories, and stories had a way of hooking into you, gnawing at your brain until you had no choice but to satisfy that nagging curiosity. I hadn't intended to be alone, though. That's where things started to go wrong. Originally, it was supposed to be me, Kyle, and Lisa, a weekend in the mountains, to unplug from the grind of daily life, as Kyle put it. Kyle, my best friend since high school, had a way of convincing me to do things that were entirely out of my comfort zone. He was the loud one, the type who could strike up a conversation with anyone. Lisa, his girlfriend, was quieter, thoughtful, but there was a sharpness to her. They were the perfect pair, and I guess I was just along for the ride, a third wheel, but a willing one. The plan was simple. We'd head up to the cabin Kyle had found online, spend a few days hiking, drinking by the fire, and just enjoying the quiet. No phones, no distractions, just us and nature. Blood Ridge was about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, nestled in a patch of forest. Rugged, isolated, and, according to Kyle, perfect for a weekend escape. The cabin itself sat at the top of a steep incline, a narrow dirt road, the only way in or out. From the photos, it looked cozy enough, if a little rustic. Wooden beams, a stone fireplace, even a small porch that overlooked the dense pine trees below. But what the pictures didn't show was the sense of foreboding that settled in your gut. The air felt heavier up there, the wind colder, sharper, like it carried something hidden between its gusts. It was Friday morning when we set off, and the drive up was uneventful for the most part. Kyle played his usual obnoxious playlist, alternating between making sarcastic comments and pestering Lisa about how she was handling the trip. I half listened, my thoughts drifting as the scenery changed from sprawling farmland to thick forest. The road became rougher, winding as we ascended into the mountains. When we finally arrived at the cabin, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the porch, and I remember feeling a slight chill run down my spine. It wasn't cold yet, but the kind of chill that felt unnatural, like the temperature had dropped just a little too fast. Kyle jumped out first, always the eager one, grinning like he'd just stumbled upon some hidden treasure. Lisa followed, looking a little less enthusiastic, but she didn't say anything. I lingered by the car, staring at the cabin, and for the first time since we'd started the trip, I felt a twinge of doubt. Something about the place felt off. "It's just a cabin," I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease. But it wasn't just a cabin. Not really. That was my first mistake, thinking it was just a cabin. We settled into the cabin that evening without much fuss, but the unease in the air didn't dissipate. It only deepened as the hours dragged on. Inside, the place was cramped but functional, with just enough space for the three of us. The furniture was old, worn down by years of use, and the walls were lined with hunting trophies. A collection of antlers, weathered photographs, and old, yellowed maps. Kyle was immediately drawn to the fireplace, struggling to get a fire started, while Lisa went about organizing the food and setting up her gear. I sat by the window, staring out into the thick forest that surrounded us. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, casting long shadows across the cabin's front yard. Beyond the trees, I could just make out the outline of the ridge. A steep drop-off that led to nothing but darkness. "What's up with you?" Kyle asked, finally managing to get the fire going. He tossed a log into the flames and turned to face me, that signature smirk playing on his lips. "Nothing," I replied, trying to shake off the weird feeling. "Just, this place, man, it's different." "Different how?" Lisa asked, glancing up from her bag. I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid. "I don't know. Just feels strange, like we're being watched or something." Kyle chuckled, dismissing my concern with a wave of his hand. "Dude, we're miles from anyone. No cell signal, no tourists, no creepy old guys with axes. It's perfect." Lisa didn't say anything, but I could tell from the way her eyes darted to the window that she wasn't entirely convinced either. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. The wind picked up outside, howling through the trees and rattling the shutters. We sat around the fire, drinking cheap beer and playing cards, trying to ignore the oppressive darkness pressing against the cabin walls. Every so often, a gust of wind would hit the side of the cabin with enough force to make the whole structure creak, as if the woods were testing its strength, probing for weak spots. But then there was a noise. Not from the wind, but from outside. It was faint, almost like a whisper at first, but it grew louder, like something scraping against the side of the cabin. I froze, my cards halfway to the table. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Lisa stopped mid-sentence, her hand instinctively reaching for Kyle's arm. Even Kyle, always the skeptic, seemed a little less confident. "Probably a branch," he muttered. But I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We all listened, the crackling of the fire, the only other sound in the cabin. Then it happened again, this time louder. A long drawn-out scrape, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the door that led to the small shed Kyle had noticed earlier. "I'll go check it out," Kyle said, standing up a little too quickly. He was trying to play it cool, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen counter and headed for the back door before I could protest. "Maybe we should all go," Lisa suggested, standing as well. Her voice was calm, but there was a slight edge to it, like she didn't want to be left behind. "Nah, it's fine," Kyle said, already halfway out the door. "I'll be right back." The door clicked shut, leaving me and Lisa alone. For a few minutes, there was nothing but silence, the fire crackling, the wind howling, the occasional creak of the old wooden beams. Then, the scraping sound returned. This time, it was louder, closer. "What the hell is he doing out there?" I asked, more to myself than to Lisa. She didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the door, her body tense. The firelight flickered across her face, casting shadows under her eyes, making her look almost hollow. We waited and waited, but Kyle didn't come back. After what felt like an eternity, I stood up, my pulse racing. "Something's wrong," I said, already heading for the door. Lisa grabbed my arm. "Wait," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Listen." I stopped, straining to hear whatever she was talking about. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the back of the cabin. They crunched on the gravel path that led to the shed, and they were getting closer. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt my hands go cold. Those weren't Kyle's footsteps. Kyle would have been back by now. Whoever was out there, it wasn't him. Without a word, Lisa and I exchanged a look. She grabbed the closest thing she could find, a rusted fireplace poker, while I grabbed the heavy flashlight Kyle had left behind. We moved toward the door, our breaths shallow, our hearts racing. The footsteps stopped just as we reached the door. For a second, everything went still. Then the door handle rattled. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Whoever was on the other side wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. They were testing the door, pulling at it, the metal groaning under the strain. Lisa's grip tightened on the poker. "We can't just wait here," she whispered. I nodded, swallowing hard. "We're not." With a deep breath, I threw the door open, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the night, revealing the empty porch. The wind whipped around us, cold and biting, but there was no one there. No one. Just the sound of the trees creaking in the wind. But then I saw it, a set of footprints in the gravel. Large, too large to be Kyle's, leading from the back of the cabin toward the ridge. And at the edge of the porch, something glistened in the flashlight's beam, a smear of blood. The wind howled louder, and for the first time that night, I felt real fear settle deep in my gut. This wasn't some prank. This wasn't just the wind. Something was out there, and it wasn't alone. Panic surged through me. A visceral, all-consuming wave of fear that I hadn't felt since we first arrived. My brain raced through the possibilities. Kyle was hurt, or worse, and something was out there, something big. But it wasn't just fear that kept me glued to the spot. It was the realization that whatever was happening, it was real, tangible. And it was getting closer. Lisa stood beside me, her face pale but determined. "We need to find him," she said, her voice low but steady. I nodded, though every instinct told me to lock the door and wait for daylight. But Kyle was still out there, and whatever had happened to him, I wasn't about to leave my best friend behind. We grabbed the flashlights and ventured into the night, every creak of the trees setting my nerves on edge. The air was sharp and bitter, and the ground crunched beneath our feet as we followed the trail of footprints toward the ridge. The blood smeared on the gravel path was faint, but it was there, leading us deeper into the woods, farther from the safety of the cabin. The wind howled louder as we reached the edge of the ridge, the trees thinning out to reveal a sheer drop-off that plunged into darkness. I shone my flashlight along the edge, searching for any sign of Kyle. There was nothing at first, just rocks and dirt, and the relentless wind whipping across the ridge. But then, I saw it. At the base of a large tree, half hidden by the underbrush, was Kyle's flashlight. It was still on, its weak beam flickering as it lay in the dirt, abandoned. "Kyle," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Lisa crouched down, picking up the flashlight and turning it over in her hands. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice tight. "He wouldn't just leave this." Before I could respond, a sound cut through the wind, low, guttural, like a growl, coming from somewhere behind us. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the forest, but there was nothing there, just the trees, tall and silent, and the endless darkness between them. But I knew what I heard, and I wasn't about to wait for it to come any closer. "Lisa," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "we need to go." She didn't argue. We both turned and started back toward the cabin, moving as quickly as we could without breaking into a full sprint. The wind whipped at our backs, and the trees seemed to close in around us, the shadows growing longer and darker with every step. And then we heard it again. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crashing through the underbrush behind us. "Run!" Lisa shouted, and we took off. the flashlights bobbing in our hands as we sprinted down the narrow path. My heart pounded in my chest, and every muscle screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Not with whatever that was getting closer. We burst through the trees and into the clearing in front of the cabin, slamming the door behind us and bolting it shut. The fire had long since died down, leaving the cabin cold and dark. Lisa collapsed against the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps, while I struggled to catch my own. For a few moments, all we could hear was the wind howling outside and the pounding of our own hearts. Then the door rattled. I jumped back, my flashlight still clutched in my hand. Someone was outside, pulling at the handle again. The door shook violently, the old wood creaking under the strain. Lisa scrambled to her feet, grabbing the poker from the hearth. "It's not him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not Kyle." I didn't need her to say it. I knew, but the door wasn't going to hold for long. Whoever was out there was determined to get inside, and the old, rickety cabin wasn't built to withstand much force. "We need to barricade it," I said, already pushing the heavy wooden table against the door. Lisa helped, shoving the chairs and whatever else we could find in front of the door, creating a makeshift barrier. But it wasn't enough. The door buckled under the force of another hit, the frame splintering. "We can't stay here," Lisa said, panic creeping into her voice. "We're trapped." I scanned the room, my mind racing. There was no back exit, no cellar, just 4 walls and a single door. But then I remembered the shed. Kyle had mentioned it earlier, and I had brushed it off, thinking it was just some old storage space. "Follow me," I said, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the back of the cabin. We shoved open the window, the cold air hitting us like a slap in the face. The shed was only a few yards away, barely visible in the darkness, but it was our only chance. We climbed through the window, dropping into the dirt below. The footsteps were louder now, closer, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. We sprinted toward the shed, our flashlights cutting through the night, and I prayed that the door wasn't locked. It wasn't. We stumbled inside, slamming the door behind us and bolting it shut. The shed was small, cramped, with shelves full of old tools and gardening supplies. A rusty axe hung on the wall, and I grabbed it without thinking, the weight of it feeling both foreign and familiar in my hands. Lisa crouched by the door, listening, her face pale but focused. "It's out there," she whispered. I nodded, gripping the axe tighter. The footsteps were right outside now, slow and deliberate, circling the shed. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and the cold seeped into my bones, and then the footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes your skin crawl. And then the door exploded inward. I swung the axe without thinking, the blade connecting with something solid. There was a grunt, a flash of movement, and then I was thrown back, crashing into the shelves behind me. The tools clattered to the floor, and the axe slipped from my hands. Lisa screamed, lunging at the figure in the doorway with the fireplace poker, but it knocked her aside like she was nothing. My vision blurred as I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing. The figure loomed in the doorway, its massive form blocking out the night. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a monster. It was a man, a tall, hulking figure, dressed in ragged clothes, his face hidden by a hood, but there was no mistaking the blood on his hands. Kyle's blood. I grabbed the nearest tool I could find, a rusted hammer, and swung it with everything I had. It connected with the side of his head, and he stumbled, giving me just enough time to grab Lisa and pull her toward the back of the shed. There was a small window, barely big enough to squeeze through, but it was our only way out. I shoved Lisa through first, then followed, my hand scraping against the rough wood as I pulled myself outside. We didn't stop running. We ran through the woods, the wind whipping at our backs, the trees blurring together in the darkness. I didn't know where we were going, or if we'd even make it out alive. But I knew one thing for certain: we couldn't stop. Not until we were far away from Blood Ridge. We didn't stop running until we saw the first glimmer of dawn on the horizon. The sky lightening just enough to give us hope. The forest thinned out as we reached the dirt road that had brought us here. My legs were on fire, my lungs burned, and every muscle in my body screamed for me to stop, but I couldn't. Not yet. The road was empty. No sign of Kyle, no sign of the man who had been hunting us. Lisa collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. I stood there, staring down the road, half expecting to see that figure emerge from the trees, still stalking us, still coming, but there was nothing. Just the wind and the distant sound of birds beginning to wake. We were alive, but Kyle was gone. And something told me that whatever had happened up on Blood Ridge, it wasn't over. We weren't the first to be hunted there, and we wouldn't be the last. Next story. I didn't grow up in Maine, but the small town of Millbury felt like a place where someone could escape. With only a few thousand people, most of them fishermen or retirees, it was a town where nothing much happened. Crystal Lake, the centerpiece of the town, brought in tourists during the summer months, but by fall, the quiet would return. That's what I needed: quiet. After breaking up with my boyfriend, I was ready to start over. I rented a small house a few miles outside of town, hidden away at the end of a narrow dirt road that cut through dense woods. It was perfect. Quiet, isolated, and peaceful. It wasn't much more than a 2-bedroom cabin with old wooden floors that creaked, no matter how lightly you stepped. But it was mine, and that felt good. My work as a freelance graphic designer allowed me to stay at home, working at all hours of the day. It suited me just fine. No need to make friends or be part of the community. I could sit by the lake or hike through the trails whenever I needed a break. I spent most evenings by myself, drinking tea and listening to the wind through the trees. I kept busy, trying not to think about why I had left the city, why I had needed to start over in the first place. But that quiet wasn't what it seemed. Something in Millbury wasn't right. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first, just a vague unease whenever I walked through town or stopped at the grocery store. The way people looked at you but didn't really see you, as if they were pretending everything was fine, but something was lurking just beneath the surface. That's when I met Officer Daniels. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't indifferent. He watched me. It all started after a small accident. I wasn't paying attention, distracted by my phone for a moment, and I clipped the side of a tree. It wasn't a major accident, just a crumpled fender and a flat tire, but it was enough to shake me up. Before I could even get out of the car to assess the damage, a patrol car appeared behind me, lights flashing. Officer Daniels stepped out. He was in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp and neat. He had that easy smile that cops like to put on when they're trying to calm you down, but there was something off about it. His eyes lingered on me a little too long. "Everything all right here, miss?" he asked, strolling up to my car. I explained what had happened, apologizing profusely, expecting a ticket or at least a lecture. But Daniels just smiled and shook his head. "Not a big deal," he said, leaning against my car. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking again, his tone shifting just slightly. "I'll let you off this time. No ticket, no paperwork. Consider it a favor." A favor? I didn't quite know how to respond. I was grateful, sure, but something in the way he said it made me feel like I owed him something. I thanked him, and he waved me off with that same smile. "Take care, miss," he said, turning back to his car. "Remember, you owe me one." I thought nothing of it at first. I figured he was just being a nice guy, helping out a newcomer in town. But that's how it all started, how Daniels worked his way into my life. For a few weeks after the accident, I didn't think much about Daniels. I was busy with work, settling into my new routine. But then I started noticing him more and more. Daniels was there, always watching. Whenever I went into town, whether it was to get groceries or just stop by the post office, Daniels was there. He always seemed to be nearby, watching. He would wave from his patrol car or nod at me from across the street. It was always casual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a coincidence. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia. After all, it was a small town, and there weren't many places to go. Of course, I'd see the local cop from time to time, but then Daniels started coming by my house. The first time, it was late in the afternoon. I had been working all day and decided to take a break, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, enjoying the quiet. I didn't hear his car until it was too late. He pulled up the driveway, parking behind my old sedan. I stood up, surprised, my heart racing just a little. "Hey there," he called, getting out of his car and walking toward me. "Just thought I'd check in, see how you're settling in." I forced a smile, trying to appear calm. "I'm doing fine, thanks." Daniels nodded, his eyes scanning the house behind me. Good. It's a quiet place out here. Can be a little lonely, though." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just nodded. Daniels didn't leave right away. He stood there for a few minutes, making small talk, asking about my work, the accident, the town. It felt like he was trying to get me to open up, to tell him more than I wanted to. Before he left, he reminded me about the favor. "Don't forget," he said with a grin. "You still owe me one." I laughed it off, but after he left, the unease settled in again. What exactly did he want from me, and why was he always around? A few days later, Daniels came by again. This time, it was early in the morning, just as I was about to leave for a meeting with a client. I was locking the front door when I heard his car pull up. I turned to see him leaning out of the window, that same easy smile on his face. "Morning," he called. "I could use your help with something." My stomach dropped. I had been dreading this moment, the moment he'd come to collect. I walked over to the car, trying to keep my expression neutral. "What's up?" I asked, hoping it would be something small. Daniels leaned over the passenger seat and handed me a stack of flyers. "We're having a town fundraiser next weekend, and I was hoping you could design a poster. Something to get the word out." I breathed a small sigh of relief. A poster, that wasn't so bad. I could do that. "Sure," I said, taking the flyers. Daniel smiled, "Knew I could count on you." "See, that favor thing works both ways." I nodded, forcing a smile. As he drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of it. Over the next few weeks, Daniels kept showing up with more requests. It started with small things: flyers, posters, a logo for the local fire department, but each time, the favor felt a little more demanding. And each time, he reminded me that I still owed him. I began to feel trapped, like I couldn't say no. He was a cop, after all. What would happen if I refused? He had let me off the hook for that accident, but it was clear he expected something in return. It wasn't just about the work. It was the way he lingered, the way he watched me. Then one night, Daniels showed up at my house again, but this time, it wasn't for a flyer or a poster. It was something much worse. It was late, around 10 p.m., when I heard the knock on the door. I had been sitting on the couch, watching TV, trying to unwind after a long day. The knock startled me. No one ever came by this late, and my house was far enough off the main road that I rarely had visitors at all. I opened the door to find Daniels standing there, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. He didn't smile this time. "I need you to do something for me," he said, his tone serious. "It's important." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "What is it?" He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, closing the door behind him. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. This wasn't like the other times. This wasn't about flyers or posters. something was different. Daniels pulled a small, unmarked envelope from his jacket and handed it to me. "Hold on to this. Don't open it. Don't ask questions. Just keep it safe." I stared at the envelope, my hands shaking slightly. "What's in it?" Daniel's expression darkened. "It's better if you don't know." I wanted to refuse, to tell him I couldn't do this, but the words wouldn't come. I was too afraid. Afraid of what might happen if I said no. Afraid of what was inside that envelope. "Just for a few days," he said, his voice low. "I'll come back for it soon." I didn't have a choice. I nodded slowly, taking the envelope from him. It felt heavier than it should have, though it was small. Daniels didn't smile this time. He didn't offer any reassurance. He just turned and left without another word, the sound of his boots echoing on the porch as he disappeared into the night. I stood there in the doorway, clutching the envelope, my mind racing. What had I just agreed to? What was in the envelope? My instincts screamed at me to open it, to find out what I had gotten myself into. But something stopped me. Fear. Fear of what would happen if I crossed Daniels. I took the envelope inside, locking the door behind me, and hid it in the back of my closet, buried beneath a pile of old sweaters. It was ridiculous, I knew. Hiding it wouldn't change anything. The favor had been asked. I was involved now, whether I liked it or not. The rest of that night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise outside my window made my heart race. The trees swayed in the wind, casting long shadows across the yard, and I found myself imagining all sorts of terrible things lurking out there, waiting for me. I kept checking the closet, making sure the envelope was still there, as if it could vanish on its own. The next few days passed in a blur of paranoia. Every time I drove into town, I half expected to see Daniels waiting for me. His cruiser would sometimes appear in the distance, parked just far enough away to make me wonder if he was watching me, or if it was a coincidence. But there were no more visits, no more requests, just the weight of that envelope pressing down on me. I kept telling myself it would be over soon, that Daniels would come back, take the envelope, and leave me alone. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Once you owe someone like Daniels, you're never really free. It was a week later when things really started to unravel. I had almost convinced myself that the worst was behind me, that maybe Daniels had forgotten about me, or found someone else to rope into his mess. But then the phone calls started. At first, they were just hang-ups. I'd pick up the phone, say hello, and there'd be nothing but silence on the other end. It happened once or twice, always from a blocked number. I figured it was a mistake, someone dialing the wrong number, or maybe a telemarketer. But then, the calls started coming more frequently. By the third night, they were happening every hour, like clockwork. I stopped answering after the first few, but the ringing wouldn't stop. It echoed through my small house, cutting through the quiet, like a blade. I unplugged the phone, but that only made me feel more isolated, more vulnerable. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching, waiting. One night, after the phone had rung for the fifth or sixth time, I heard something else, a sound outside, a branch breaking, maybe, or the crunch of footsteps in the gravel driveway. I froze, my heart hammering. The house was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the trees. I moved to the window slowly, peeking out from behind the curtain. There was nothing there, just the empty driveway and the dark woods beyond. But the feeling that I wasn't alone didn't go away. It wrapped around me like a blanket, heavy and suffocating. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on the couch with a kitchen knife clutched in my hand. I waited for something to happen, but nothing did. The next morning, I decided to go into town. I hadn't been out of the house in days, and I needed to clear my head. The thought of running into Daniels terrified me, but staying in that house, waiting for something terrible to happen, was driving me insane. I stopped at the diner for coffee, sitting in one of the booths near the window. It was a weekday, so the place was mostly empty, Just a few regulars, sitting at the counter talking about the weather. I tried to focus on my coffee, to push the fear out of my mind, but it was impossible. All I could think about was the envelope hidden in my closet, the phone calls, the sounds outside my window at night. That's when she walked in. She was about my age, maybe a little younger, but she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was messy, her clothes wrinkled. There was a wildness in her eyes that made my stomach twist. She looked around the diner, like she was searching for someone, and when her eyes landed on me, she froze. I didn't recognize her, but she walked straight over to my booth, her eyes wide with panic. She sat down across from me without asking, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. "You have to help me," she whispered, her voice low and urgent. My blood ran cold. "Who?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. She leaned in closer, her eyes darting around the diner. "Daniels," she hissed. He won't leave me alone. He's been following me, watching me. I tried to get away, but he won't stop." My heart pounded in my chest. This woman, whoever she was trapped, just like I was. She knew Daniels, knew what he was capable of. The panic in her voice was the same fear that had been gnawing at me for weeks. I opened my mouth to ask her what had happened, but she grabbed my wrist, her grip tight and desperate. "You can't trust him," she said. "He's not what he seems. He's dangerous." I pulled my hand away, my mind racing. What had Daniels done to her? And more importantly, what was he going to do to me? Before I could say anything, she stood up, glancing over her shoulder like someone was watching her. "Meet me tonight," she whispered, "behind the old gas station on Route 9. I'll explain everything." And with that, she was gone, slipping out of the diner as quickly as she had come. I sat there, my coffee cold in front of me, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What was Daniels hiding? What had he done to that woman? And why did she think I could help her? I spent the rest of the day in a fog, unable to focus on anything except the woman's words. I knew I shouldn't meet her, knew it was probably a terrible idea, but something inside me couldn't let it go. She had answers I needed. That night, I drove out to Route 9, the old highway that ran parallel to the town. The gas station she had mentioned had been abandoned for years, its rusted sign barely legible, the pumps long since removed. I parked my car on the side of the road and waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. I kept checking my watch, my nerves fraying with every second. Had something happened to her? Had Daniels found out? Just as I was about to give up and leave, I saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was her. She slipped into the passenger seat, her hands trembling as she pulled her coat tighter around herself. "We don't have much time," she said, glancing around nervously. "He's probably watching." "Tell me what's going on," I said, my voice shaking. "Why is Daniels after you?" She took a deep breath, her eyes welling up with tears. "He's not just a cop. He's working with them, the syndicate. They control everything in this town. The drugs, the money, everything. And Daniels, he's their enforcer. Anyone who gets in their way, anyone who asks too many questions, they disappear." I felt a chill run down my spine. I had heard rumors about a crime syndicate operating in the area, but I had always assumed it was just gossip. But now, hearing it from her, it felt real. Too real. "I tried to leave," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But he found me. He always finds me." I stared at her, my mind racing. "Why me?" I asked. "Why did he pull me into this?" She shook her head. "You were convenient. He uses people, traps them with favors, makes them think they owe him. And once he has you, there's no escape." I sat back in my seat, my hands gripping the steering wheel. Daniels had been watching me for weeks, manipulating me, pulling me into his web, and now I was in too deep to get out. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling. The woman looked at me, her eyes filled with desperation. We have to expose him. We have to get proof. It was risky, insanely risky, but we didn't have a choice. If we didn't act, Daniels would destroy us both. We needed evidence, something concrete that we could take to the authorities. Someone outside of Millbury, who wasn't under Daniel's thumb. That's when she told me about the warehouse. It was an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of town, near the train tracks. According to her, it was where Daniels and the syndicate stored their money, their drugs, everything that tied them to the corruption in Millbury. We knew the risks, but the fear of staying silent was worse than the fear of facing Daniels. We couldn't run anymore. Rachel, that was her name, convinced me this was our only chance to take him down. If we didn't, Daniels would tighten his grip until there was no escape. We drove to the outskirts of town that night. It was nearly midnight, and the roads were empty. Fog rolled in from the lake, and the air was damp and cold. The warehouse loomed ahead of us, dark and foreboding. It looked abandoned, the windows cracked, the walls covered in graffiti, but Rachel was certain it was still in use. She said it was where Daniels and his crew stored their shipments, the drugs, the money, everything that kept them in power. We parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, sticking to the shadows. My heart pounded with every step. Rachel led the way to a side entrance, a rusted metal door that was slightly ajar. I didn't ask how she knew about it. I just followed her inside. The warehouse was bigger inside than I had expected. Stacks of crates lined the walls, some of them marked with cryptic symbols, others unmarked. The air smelled of dust and something else, something chemical and bitter. We crept deeper into the warehouse, my heart racing. We could hear voices. They were coming from a small office in the back of the building. A single light flickered inside, casting shadows on the cracked window. I could make out the sound of two men talking. Rachel motioned for me to stop as we got closer. I crouched down behind a crate, my heart thudding in my chest. "Next shipment comes in tomorrow night," one of the voices said. "Daniels will be there to make sure it goes smoothly." I pulled out my phone and started recording, zooming in on the men talking inside the office. One of them was flipping through a thick wad of cash, while the other was on the phone, discussing details of the shipment. It was all their drugs, money, Daniel's name. Rachel gave me a nod, her face pale but determined. We had enough. It was time to leave. But as we turned to go, the door to the office creaked open. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as footsteps echoed through the warehouse. I turned, slowly, my heart pounding. Daniel stepped into the warehouse, his cold eyes locking onto us immediately. Well, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I knew you two would be stupid enough to try something like this." Rachel's hand tightened around my arm, but I couldn't move. Daniel stood between us and the exit. "You think you're going to take me down with a couple of videos?" he sneered, stepping closer. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." My mind raced. He had us cornered. I glanced around the warehouse, looking for anything I could use to get us out of this. Then I saw a metal pipe lying on the ground, just behind Daniel's. I didn't think, I just acted. I grabbed the pipe and swung it with all my strength. The pipe connected with Daniel's shoulder. He stumbled back, cursing, and that was the opening we needed. Rachel bolted for the door, and I followed, my heart pounding in my ears as we ran. Daniels shouted after us, his footsteps echoing behind us, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. We burst out of the warehouse and into the cold night air. Rachel was already at the car, fumbling with the keys. I could hear Daniels getting closer, his footsteps heavy and uneven as he chased us. "Hurry!" I shouted, glancing over my shoulder. Daniels was only a few feet away, his gun now drawn. Rachel finally got the door unlocked, and we scrambled inside. The engine roared to life just as Daniels reached us, but I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as we sped away. I didn't dare slow down until we were miles away from the warehouse. The road behind us was empty, but I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Daniel's cruiser catching up. My hands were shaking on the wheel, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. Rachel sat beside me, her face pale and streaked with tears, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. We didn't speak the entire drive to the state police station. When we finally arrived, I parked the car and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. We had everything we needed: the video, the recordings, the proof that Daniels was tied to the syndicate. We handed it all over to the police. It took hours, and it wasn't easy. The officers were skeptical at first, clearly aware of who Daniels was and the influence he had in the area. But once they saw the evidence, things started to change. Within days, Daniels was arrested, along with several key members of the syndicate. The news spread quickly through Millbury, shaking the town to its core. People were stunned. Some were relieved, while others were terrified of what might come next. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe again. Rachel and I both testified in court. Daniels glared at us the entire time, his eyes cold and filled with hatred. But there was nothing he could do. The evidence was overwhelming, and even those who had once supported him were now eager to save themselves by turning on him. In the end, Daniels was convicted on multiple charges: drug trafficking, conspiracy, corruption. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The syndicate collapsed in the aftermath, its grip on Millbury finally broken. The town was free, but it didn't feel like a victory. Rachel and I parted ways after the trial. She went back to her life, and I tried to rebuild mine. I moved away from Millbury, far from the memories of that terrible night, far from the fear that had once consumed me. But the scars remained. I still think about Daniels sometimes, still see his face in my nightmares. He may be locked away, but the fear he left behind lingers. Even now, in my new life, I can't forget what happened. But I survived, and in the end, that's enough. The memories will always be there, but they no longer have the power to control me. Daniels is gone, powerless, and the town that once lived in fear has finally started to heal. I still wonder what might have happened if I hadn't met Rachel, if I hadn't found the courage to fight back. But those are thoughts for another time. For now, I can finally sleep in peace, knowing it's over. Next story. I didn't think much of it when I first began seeing Dr. Conrad. I had been managing my own life fairly well, or so I convinced myself. The sleepless nights were growing longer, my days blurring into one another, and my thoughts were a constant loop of unfinished tasks. But wasn't that just how life worked? A high-pressured job in a fast-paced world with no room for stillness. My friends insisted I find someone to talk to, someone who could help me unwind. To me, it all felt like a waste of time. I didn't need to pay someone to listen to me complain about things I could fix by working harder, staying up longer, and being more disciplined. But the tension was wearing on me. A recent promotion gave me a new office in downtown Toronto, but it brought longer hours and higher stakes. My inbox was constantly full, and my phone buzzed with new requests. Meetings were so tightly packed, I often skipped lunch. My apartment had become nothing more than a place to sleep, shower, and leave. It wasn't until I snapped at my coworkers, feeling anger rise from nowhere, that I finally relented. Dr. Conrad's name came up from a close friend, someone I trusted, someone who said he had a way of cutting through the noise. I figured, what could it hurt? His office was located in a quiet part of town, between two old but well-kept buildings. The neighborhood felt hidden, unless you were looking for it. The building had an old-world charm, with brick and ivy climbing its sides, and a small placard that read Dr. Samuel Conrad, licensed psychologist. When I first walked in, the atmosphere was calming in a sterile way: clean lines, muted colors, soft chairs, the kind of office designed to put your mind at ease. Dr. Conrad himself was the picture of professionalism. mid-40s, dark hair with a few threads of gray, always in a neatly pressed suit. He welcomed me into his office with a warm smile, and I immediately felt a sense of relief, like maybe he could help me after all. The first session was simple enough, just him listening, nodding occasionally, asking me to describe what was weighing on my mind. I told him about the stress at work, the pressure to perform, the feeling of being stretched too thin. He didn't offer much advice at first, just reassured me that it was normal to feel this way under such intense pressure. I left the session feeling lighter, hopeful, even. Maybe this was what I needed. Maybe all those people telling me to talk to someone were right. Over the next few weeks, I began to feel like I could finally breathe again. Dr. Conrad was patient, quick to point out that these things took time, that my issues weren't the kind that could be solved overnight, and I believed him. But small things started to bother me. Subtle comments he made lingered in my mind long after. Things like "you're very lucky to have found me when you did," or "I've seen others spiral out of control when they waited too long." At first, I brushed them off as reassurance, but over time, they began to feel like more than that, like they were meant to plant seeds of doubt. It wasn't until the third or fourth session that I started to notice something was off. The sessions at first felt like a safe space-time carved out of my overwhelming schedule to talk, vent, and clear my head. Dr. Conrad never pressed me too hard. He allowed me to guide the conversation, offering insight here and there, but never pushing too far. But over time, it felt like the balance shifted. We were talking about my work stress, the constant grind, and the pressure from my boss. It seemed like a typical session, until Dr. Conrad leaned forward slightly and said, "Maybe the problem isn't the job itself. Maybe it's the people around you making things worse." I was taken aback by the comment. I had never considered my coworkers or my boss to be the source of my stress. Sure, work was demanding, but I believed the pressure came from the job itself, not the people. Dr. Conrad must have seen the confusion on my face, because he quickly followed up. "You don't notice it because you're so deep into it, but it's possible that they're undermining you. Little things, small comments, microaggressions that you've internalized without realizing." I wanted to protest, to push back against the idea that my team people I had worked with for years were somehow conspiring against me. But the way he said it, the calm certainty in his voice, made me pause. Maybe there was something there. Maybe I hadn't been paying close enough attention. It was subtle at first, but after that session, I began to see things differently. Every offhand comment from a coworker, every email from my boss that was even slightly curt, felt like a personal attack. I started to doubt their intentions, wonder if they were setting me up to fail, if they were waiting for me to crack under pressure. I began isolating myself at work, avoiding small talk, keeping my head down. The more I retreated, the more Dr. Conrad's words echoed in my head during each session. He encouraged the isolation, subtly suggesting that I didn't need to rely on others to succeed. "You've always been the strongest person. They don't want to see you win," he would say. As the weeks went on, I became more dependent on my sessions with him. I started to schedule them more frequently, needing that validation, needing his calm voice to reassure me that I wasn't losing my mind. But as my world at work shrank, my reliance on Dr. Conrad grew. Then came the first real sign that something was seriously wrong. I had just finished a particularly stressful day at work. Nothing seemed to go right. Deadlines were missed, emails went unanswered, and a meeting that I had painstakingly prepared for fell apart in front of me. By the time I got home, I was ready to collapse. I barely had the energy to eat dinner before falling into bed. But as I was drifting off to sleep, I noticed something strange. My phone was missing. I was sure I had it with me when I came home. I remembered checking it for messages after I left the office, but now, as I searched my apartment, it was nowhere to be found. I tried retracing my steps, tearing apart my bag, checking under the couch cushions, but it was gone. The next morning, I went into work early, hoping I had left it on my desk, but it wasn't there either. Panic set in. My phone was my lifeline. It had all my contacts, my work calendar, everything. Losing it felt like a disaster, but I tried to calm myself. I would just go to the store and get a new one. It was inconvenient, but not the end of the world. But when I mentioned it to Dr. Conrad during my next session, his response left me shaken. "You didn't lose it," he said confidently, almost dismissively. "Someone took it." "What do you mean?" I asked. He smiled that patient smile he always wore, but this time it felt different, calculated. "Think about it. You've been feeling watched, haven't you? Like someone at work is keeping tabs on you. Maybe they've been looking for a way to sabotage you, and your phone was the perfect opportunity." I didn't want to believe him, but as he spoke, a part of me started to wonder if he was right. After all, I had been feeling paranoid lately. Maybe my missing phone wasn't just an accident. Maybe someone really had taken it. The more I thought about it, the more plausible it seemed. And Dr. Conrad, as always, was there to gently nudge me further down that path. The turning point came when Dr. Conrad suggested that we meet outside of his office. It seemed harmless at first, just a casual meeting at a cafe, somewhere less formal. He said it would help to break out of the traditional therapy setting, allow me to see things from a different perspective. By this time, I had grown so accustomed to relying on his guidance that I didn't even question the suggestion. We met at a small, dimly lit cafe, not far from his office. It was quiet, nearly empty, with only a few patrons scattered around. As soon as I sat down, I noticed how different he seemed outside of his office. There was no warmth in his smile this time, no soothing tone in his voice. He was more direct, more assertive. He didn't ask how I was feeling, or if I wanted to talk about my week. Instead, he launched right into a conversation that felt more like a strategy meeting than therapy. "You've been making progress," he said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "But there are still people in your life holding you back." I frowned, unsure of what he meant. "I've cut off most of the people who were causing me stress. I've barely been talking to anyone outside of work in these sessions." He nodded, but there was something unsettling about the way he did it. "There's still one person you haven't distanced yourself from," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Your boss." I blinked, taken aback. My boss, sure, she was demanding, but she had always been fair with me. We had a professional relationship. Dr. Conrad leaned forward, his voice lowering. "She's the reason you're feeling like this. She's the one keeping you under control, making you feel like you're not good enough. Haven't you noticed? Every time you try to make progress, she's there to pull you back down." A cold chill ran through me. Was that true? I had never seen it that way before, but the more Dr. Conrad spoke, the more it made sense. The subtle dismissals in meetings, the lack of praise for my work, the cutting comments. It was all there, right in front of me, and I had been too blind to see it. Dr. Conrad must have noticed the doubt in my eyes, because he pushed harder. "You need to take control of your life. Cut her out before she destroys you." I sat back, my heart racing. "Cut her out? How?" His smile returned, but this time it sent a wave of unease through me. "There are ways," he said simply, his tone casual, as if he were suggesting I changed my coffee order. "You're strong. You don't need her." I couldn't breathe. Was he saying what I thought he was saying? I looked around the cafe, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. No one was paying attention to us. No one could hear this conversation except me. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned back, his eyes never leaving mine. "You know what I mean." The implications hung heavy in the air between us. My boss, the one person standing in my way, the one person who could ruin everything if I didn't act. I stood up suddenly, the chair scraping against the floor. My mind was racing, thoughts tumbling over each other in a tangled mess. I needed air. I needed to think. I mumbled something about needing to go and practically ran out of the cafe. my heart pounding in my chest. For days after that meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Conrad had crossed a line. I replayed the conversation over and over, trying to make sense of it. Was I really in danger from my boss? Had he pushed too far? The paranoia that had once been confined to my coworkers now spread to every part of my life. I couldn't trust anyone. Every glance from a stranger, every comment from a colleague felt like a threat. I tried to distance myself from Dr. Conrad, canceling sessions and ignoring his calls, but it wasn't that easy. His words had taken root, twisting my thoughts until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. Every time I thought about my boss, I felt a wave of anger, of fear, as if she was plotting. I couldn't think straight. It all came to a head one night when I received an email from her, nothing out of the ordinary, just a reminder about an upcoming deadline. But something about the tone of the email set me off. It felt cold, dismissive, like she was testing me, waiting for me to fail. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and dialed Dr. Conrad's number, my hands shaking as I waited for him to pick up. "Hello?" His voice was calm, as always. "I need to talk," I said. My voice cracked. I don't know what to do. There was a pause, and then he said, "I'm glad you called. It's time to take action." I arrived at Dr. Conrad's office late that evening. The city outside, dark and quiet. His office was dimly lit, the usual calming atmosphere now, feeling suffocating. He was waiting for me, standing by the window with his back to the door, staring out at the city below. "You've made the right choice," he said, without turning around. "It's time to take control." My heart was racing as I sat down. "I don't know what to do," I admitted. "I feel like everything is falling apart." He finally turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "That's because you're resisting the truth," he said. "You've known for a long time what needs to be done, but you've been too afraid to act." I felt like I was spiraling, the walls closing in around me. "What are you saying?" Dr. Conrad smiled, a cold, calculated smile. "You need to eliminate the source of your pain." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stood up, backing away from him. "You're saying I should kill her?" He didn't answer right away, just watched me with that same calm expression. "It's the only way you'll be free," he said finally. "She's been controlling you for too long. If you don't stop her, she'll destroy you." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The man who had been helping me, guiding me, was now telling me to kill my boss. My head was spinning, my thoughts racing. How had it come to this? How had I let him manipulate me like this? I backed toward the door, my hand on the doorknob. "I can't do this," I whispered. "I won't." Dr. Conrad's expression didn't change. "You'll come around," he said. "You always do." I ran out of the office, my mind a blur. The realization hit me like a freight train. He had been manipulating me all along. This wasn't therapy. This was control. He had been planting seeds of paranoia, isolating me, making me doubt everything. And now, he wanted me to commit murder. I didn't go back to work the next day. I couldn't. The thought of seeing my boss, of being around people who might see through the fear in my eyes, was too much. I spent the day in my apartment, locked away from the world, trying to piece together how I had let things get this far. It wasn't until the evening that I decided to do something about it. I called the police, told them everything. I didn't mention the murder suggestion. I couldn't say it. The police investigated, but Dr. Conrad was smart. Too smart. There was no proof, no evidence of anything inappropriate. I was just another stressed-out professional who had let anxiety get the best of her. I was advised to seek help elsewhere, but I knew the truth. I knew that Dr. Conrad was still out there, still manipulating his patients, still planting those seeds of doubt and paranoia, and I wasn't the first. I wouldn't be the last. I quit my job, moved to a new city. I changed my number, cut ties with everyone I knew in Toronto. But every now and then, I still feel it, that nagging doubt, that quiet voice in the back of my mind, wondering if maybe he was right after all. Maybe my boss had been against me. Maybe the paranoia wasn't all in my head. But deep down, I know the truth. Dr. Conrad twisted everything, made me see things that weren't there. But even knowing that, it doesn't make it go away. There are days when I catch myself doubting again. A casual conversation at the grocery store, a friendly gesture from a new colleague. It always starts the same way. That little nagging voice suggesting that maybe, just maybe, they don't have my best interests at heart. It takes all my strength to push those thoughts away, to remind myself that they are just echoes of what he planted in my mind. It's exhausting. Living with that constant doubt, that constant second guessing. I've tried to find peace, tried to distance myself from the paranoia, but it's always there. I wonder if his other patients feel the same way. I wonder if they, too, are living in a haze of suspicion, never quite able to trust anyone again. I wonder how many of them have already fallen into the trap, believing his words completely. And then, I wonder what happens when they follow through on his suggestions. Did anyone else get as close as I did to crossing that line? It's a chilling thought. The idea that out there, someone might have already acted on his manipulation. Maybe they thought they were eliminating a threat, just like he suggested. Maybe, for them, the paranoia became too much. I'm one of the lucky ones. One managed to get out before it was too late. But not without scars. Not without the lingering fear that, even though I escaped, I'm never truly free. Dr. Conrad's influence stretches far beyond the therapy room. Sometimes I wonder if he thinks about me, if he regrets losing control over me, or if I'm just one patient in a long line of victims. Victims who have no idea how deeply they've been manipulated. I wonder if his new patients will catch on sooner than I did, or if they'll end up like me, forever haunted by the whispers of paranoia. He's still out there, I know it, and I can't help but wonder how many others he's manipulating, right now. I wonder if they'll ever escape. Every now and then, I consider seeking help again, seeing a new therapist to work through the lingering effects of what happened. But the thought of opening up to someone else terrifies me. What if it happens again? What if this new therapist is just like Dr. Conrad, planting seeds in my mind, waiting for them to grow into something sinister? It's hard to trust, hard to believe that not everyone is like him. That maybe, somewhere, there are people who genuinely want to help. But for now, I keep my distance. I stick to myself, careful not to let anyone too close. I can't afford to go through that again. I've already lost too much, and I can't risk losing more. So I stay isolated, trying to rebuild my life, trying to move on. But it's not easy. The memories are always there, just below the surface, ready to pull me back into that dark place. I fight against them, but some days, it feels like a losing battle. Some days, I wonder if I'll ever truly be free. I thought moving away would solve everything, that putting distance between myself and the city where it all happened would make it easier to forget. But it didn't. The paranoia followed me, no matter where I went. It's not about the place, it's about the damage he caused. It's about the way he rewired my mind, made me see threats where there were none. And even though I know it's not real, even though I can tell myself it's all in my head, it doesn't make it any easier to cope. I've learned to live with it, to manage the paranoia as best I can. I don't let it control me anymore, but it's always there, lurking. I avoid situations that could trigger those thoughts, keep my distance from people who might unknowingly feed into it. I've learned to navigate around it, but I'll never be the same. Dr. Conrad changed me. He planted something in my mind that I'll carry with me forever. But at least now, I know what it is. At least now, I'm aware of it.